Moxley, Mackey, Mayhew,
Yes.
Reuter,
Yes.
West.
Present.
Special Interim Committee on the Impact of U.S. Nuclear Weapons Programs in Missouri will come to order. And we do want to say that we have 3 representatives that are en route, and they will come and join the committee when they get here. They ran into some emergencies. The purpose of the Special Interim Committee is to document concerns of affected communities, health professionals, environmental experts, and policymakers. Based on the findings and testimonies, the Special Interim Committee will develop actionable recommendations for legislation. And I just want to say, I'm very hopeful that we will be able to produce some results and some conversations today that will lead to some tangible action items that may not be just legislation, but also could be legislation to overall help Missourians. The committee will now receive testimony from members of the public. All individuals testifying today or those wishing to go on record must complete a signed witness appearance form. They're here at the table. And please lay your form on the witness stand when you're ready to testify. If you submitted a witness form online, you do not need to complete a paper copy as well. Just ensure that you have completed the email verification to finalize your online submission. Now, today we did plan on this being live streamed, but there was complications that didn't allow that to happen. So anybody that is watching this live, you're probably seeing a delay of 24 to 48 hours. You can email me as the chair, and that information will be on the page. We will make that part of the attachment. However, it won't be the official testimony. That would need to be done by midnight tonight. When you're ready to begin your testimony, please make sure your microphone's on. There's a on-off switch in the back of the mic. You can tap the mic just to make sure that it is on. That way, you can clearly state your name and the entity you are representing, if it is official, and that will allow it to be heard on the recording. So the first witness that I would like to come before us is the Army Corps. The Army Corps does have a representative here, so if you could come forward, we'll get the meeting started.
Thank you, Representative Burns. Thank you for bringing this together, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak at this meeting. Unfortunately, our District Commander, Colonel Kinnear, had a family emergency and he could not be here today, so I am here. Phil Mosier, the Chief of the Cruise Draft and Environmental Branch of the Army Corps of Engineers St. Louis District, and I wanted to just express our interest and willingness to continue to be involved and help this initiative and help you and the committee with any information that is needed, as well as help everyone understand our commitment to this community and our understanding and acknowledgement of the past wrongs that have been done by the U.S. government, and our willingness and commitment to continue to correct those with our formally utilized sites remedial action program and the remediation that we have done over the past almost 3 decades now, and will continue to do as our commitment to the North St. Louis County community and the St. Louis community at large.
Thank you. And really quick, is there any way to turn the volume up, or we'll just gonna get just a few minutes. So we can turn it up a little bit. I'm having a hard time hearing. I think it's a me problem. Okay.
Test.
Okay.
Just gotta make sure you're close to the mic.
A little bit louder. We have some people that's, okay. Now if you can test again, that would be great.
Test.
That's perfect, thank you. Okay, so, do you have a moment for me to ask some questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, your role is primarily, what areas are you guys cleaning in Missouri?
In Missouri, the Army Corps of Engineers, as part of the Cruise Wrap, is cleaning up areas in St. Louis downtown site and also the North St. Louis County sites at the St. Louis Airport site and Laddie Avenue, as well as the St. Louis Airport site vicinity properties that include Coldwater Creek in its origination at the St. Louis Airport site as far as the contamination goes, all the way to the Missouri River.
Okay, and when did you guys start doing that roughly?
The Army Corps of Engineers got the mission as given to us by Congress in 1997.
Okay, 1997. Okay, and I've personally been to some of the public meetings, and one of the things that I wanted to see how we can support, being part of the armed community, everyone here is aware of it. We understand the issues. It's affected my family. Many of the people on the committee, it's affected their family. When we see somebody from the federal government come, usually we'll ask questions about our health. Often you guys aren't in a position to answer that. We've talked a little bit about how we could support you from maybe state agencies, but can you talk about that difficulty that you have if people ask questions about their health, but you're not health experts?
Yes, ma'am. So that is a question we do get quite a bit as far as health concerns, and we want to understand and acknowledge all of, like I said, the past wrongs that were done, and know that there is a mission associated with that, while also understanding that our mission is the current contamination that is there and is cleaning it up in accordance with our authority and record of decision. I do want to say that I appreciate all of the cooperation and coordination that we do have with the state agencies, including Department of Natural Resources, Department of Health and Senior Services, as well as EPA Region 7 and the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. We update those stakeholders on a regular basis and appreciate their coordination and anything and any potential solution to that effect as far as health questions and anything of that nature moving forward.
Do you feel at public meetings you have enough people to answer those questions about health? Or do you ever run into problems with having the manpower to answer them?
I do feel we have good representation over the years from all of those agencies I mentioned, and I think sometimes it may just depend on the scheduling aspect and our ability to coordinate well in advance so that we have the sufficient amount of resources to include state and local county health representatives at some of those meetings to help answer some of those questions from the interested public.
Okay, and if, sometimes we talk about things like signs or cleanup timeframes. Is there a way that the public or your state officials could help advocate? There's probably, I would imagine, there's budget at the federal level, there's orders that come down from them. How would we effectively, if we want any improvement in cleanup or we want any timeline, how could we effectively do that?
In order to influence the timeline for remediation, there are a lot of things at play, including logistical aspects and the budget associated with that. I will say over the past 7 or 8 years, we have increased production in the North St. Louis County area to expedite the remediation as much as possible while doing it safely and effectively as well. Another aspect of that is making sure that we are staying true to the rules and regulations that we do need to follow. I mentioned the agencies that we do coordinate with on a regular basis and making sure that we are doing that in accordance with our authority and, of course, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation Liability Act, or CERCLA for short, and continuing that moving forward. So we're definitely committed to looking at everything possible in order to get this area cleaned up as fast as we possibly can. And the Army Corps of Engineers have been doing this for quite some time, and I think there's a lot of lessons learned that we have learned over the year that we can also incorporate moving forward as we undertake all of the complex, challenging remediations that we're doing along Coldwater Creek.
Can you talk a little bit about your testing? It comes up often that, it's a creek, there's moving water, there's flood water, and as you're trying to test and an area is marked clean,
it's hard to communicate to the public. I know I've had a hard time understanding, how do you mark something clean if water continues to move? Can you speak to your testing capabilities and what that looks like?
Yes, ma'am. So in order to do an investigation, you have to have a starting point. Our starting point for Coldwater Creek specifically is that 10-year floodplain. And then we will move outside of that depending on if there is additional contamination. Long story short, if there's additional contamination and you keep testing, you will keep going until you find the end of that contamination.
What if that goes on to someone's private property? Is that a boundary, or do you communicate with the private property owner?
No, ma'am, and that's a good point, is that we have extensive coordination with every individual property owner, whether it's a private or public entity throughout the North St. Louis County sites, to include Coldwater Creek. And we have had that coordination up front to go and do the investigation, and then we continue that coordination if we do need to do remediation on that property. And then finally, if there is remediation, producing them a document that shows what was there, what was removed, and how that property can be free and cleared to moving forward.
Now, I know this might be outside your scope, but if there is, if you do find contamination on someone's private property, does it go part of the permit, some permanent record moving forward if they denied cleanup? I'll just get to the whole topic. You have a private property owner. How do we ensure the next person that would own that property, let's say it's a home, is aware of what their property was involved in the cleanup? So you're gonna have people that agree to probably have their yards or something cleaned up. You might have people that don't want to be involved in that. How do you guys document that, or are you able to?
Yes, ma'am, that is part of the overall documentation process. Every individual property within the boundary and within our authority has some sort of official documentation that will live with that, with our program, and be part of the permanent record from now on. So right now, we have that permanent record, and even once we are done with that, that will transfer over to Department of Energy Legacy Management for their long-term management of the records aspect of it. So there will always be some sort of acknowledgement that if that were to happen, that there could still be contamination on a certain property, and also look and coordinating with the state agencies as well to come up with a system to make sure that that is understood throughout if anybody comes into that property and there's wanting to purchase it.
Okay, and then if somebody comes along and they buy a property, whether there's remediation or that property owner previously did not do remediation, how does that new property owner get notified? And I'm just gonna ask those several questions at once. How do they get notified? And if they have questions, let's say a flood happens again and they want to be retested, I don't know if that's really ever been a thing, how would they communicate those concerns?
Those concerns can definitely be brought to us. We have a normal means of communication with our email address, a dedicated email address, with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, STL FUSRAP. And we also have a public line for people to call with any concerns, as well as any of our local elected officials. If any interest, any concerns are brought to them, we're willing to answer questions, have specific meetings. And we also reach out to any of the current property owners where there is contamination on their property at a normal basis to make sure we're keeping them up to date on our investigation process and eventual remediation if that needs to happen. That portion includes our realty specialist, keeping tabs on the ownership of the property so that we can make sure that if it does change hands, that we're in contact with that new owner.
Do you know if there's any people on on private wells within your boundaries?
I do not, I'm not aware of any private wells within our boundaries. And I think that is not necessarily for our portion of it, but it is because of the lack of suitable drinking water within our area that wells are not allowed.
Okay, so right now you don't believe that there's anyone on private wells in that area? that comes up in other areas, but I know that you don't have jurisdiction on some of the other areas, so we'll table that. That, there might be members of the committee, do you have any questions? Representative Mayhew. And the mic is on the back.
That's kind of interesting. Thank you, Madam Chair. I got a few questions for you here, and some of you kind of touched on a little bit, but just bear with me if you don't mind. Do you think that, does the Corps think that they've identified all the sites and their extent?
For our purposes here in the St. Louis area, we do believe we have identified all of the sites and areas that do have contamination, and we're incorporating that into the overall schedule to go and do that remediation.
And yes, so I'm not specifically talking about the actual location that was owned by the federal government. We pretty much know what those are, right? It's any site that has been affected by the location of that particular facility.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so, because I hear that there are sites that were utilized that might not have been on the record, so to speak. So, contamination at the time probably legally, but would be considered illegal dumping or moving stuff to other locations. Are you aware of any of those kind of things that went on, and have you identified them if they did?
We're always open to any information on any area like that, for sure. And if the evidence points to us going and doing additional investigation in those areas, we most certainly will.
Okay. Is nuclear refuse the only contaminant concern on these various sites, or are there organic compounds that were utilized in the process, anything like that that is also a concern that you're looking for?
The specific contaminants of concern that we have on our St. Louis sites, majority of it radioactive, but there are some other elements that were associated with the refining process at the downtown site that are associated with that, some of them being arsenic and cadmium, for instance.
And you have located those particular contaminants on these sites in sufficient quantities?
There are some trace amounts of those contaminants at some of the sites within a certain area, and then those contaminants do get remediated if they are with the radioactive contamination to be associated with that refining process.
What if they're separate from?
If they're separate from, then there could be other instances that are other industrial practices that could have contributed to that, and that is a case-by-case scenario to make sure that if we are cleaning something up, it's within our authority and those contaminants of concern that we are charged with cleaning up.
Why would that not be under your authority? Why would a separate contaminant not without nuclear components, but was part of the process? Why wouldn't that be part of your project?
The only thing I can say is, like I said, it's a case-by-case scenario where if there is a contaminant that's maybe associated with that process, but it's not commingled with the radioactive contamination, we have sufficient documentation out there saying that if you look at the area, it could be some other industrial use of that contaminant that caused that contamination.
But you wouldn't leave it lay.
It depends on the case-by-case scenario, sir.
Okay. So is there some regulation or statute that would prevent you from, on those particular sites, we're talking about the contaminated sites, we're not necessarily talking about somewhere else where someone else might have been responsible for that contamination. But is there any government bureaucracy that would prevent you from also addressing that contaminant of concern once identified that was not commingled with the nuclear waste?
As I mentioned before, we have specific authority under FUSREP for contaminants of concern associated with the Manhattan Engineering District Atomic Energy Commission process. And if it falls outside of that, then no, we cannot address it further.
Thank you. Does the Corps do all the cleanup at the nuclear sites, or is there another agency that's also responsible?
We are responsible for the sites under the FUSREP, or the Formerly Utilized Sites Remedial Action Program, those being the St. Louis sites, the St. Louis downtown site, and the North St. Louis County sites that are in the St. Louis area. Any other sites are under a different agency.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the map here of the Formerly Utilized Sites Remedial Action Program. That's the FUSREP, right?
Yes, sir.
And it appears that there are several, but not all, of the sites that come to mind that were associated with the nuclear weapons program are on this map, but these are only the FUSREP sites. So all of them on this map of the United States would be something the Corps would be directly responsible for cleanup.
Yes, sir.
Okay. What is the timeline for the projects in the St. Louis and environs? And you don't have to give me dates certain, but is it 20 year? Is it 40 year? Is it 100 years? What does the Corps expect to have as a timeline for when they say, hey, we're done, we got it cleaned up?
The longest duration of project that we have right now is for the North St. Louis County sites, and we're estimating completion of remediation around 2036, with turnover to legacy management in 2038.
So legacy management, meaning that we probably have some ongoing commitment on that site from a federal government standpoint.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and that probably will boil down to whatever remediation system that you're going to be using, whether it's pumping wells or whatever, right? That would be the sort of commitment that you'd be talking about, and the legacy management, right?
For legacy management, it would be, for our site specifically, it would be if there's environmental monitoring associated with any contamination that would be deemed inaccessible, as well as the management of records.
But also limiting access to the property and those kind of things.
Yes, sir.
So an ongoing personnel presence on those sites would be likely into the future.
Yes, sir.
Along with fencing and signage and those kind of things, right?
If it was part of the control plan, of course.
Okay. Are the properties affected, including the ones in private hands that you've identified or may be identified in the future? Ben, is the extent, characterization, and the contaminative concern, is that all public record? Can that be accessed through a map or some other thing on the Corps site?
Yes, sir. We have been putting out status maps on our website that show the areas that are contaminated within, close to the St. Louis Airport site, as well as throughout Coldwater Creek. And once we finalize the documentation on those properties, whether it's the investigation and we're able to release that property, or we have to do remediation and then do that documentation to release that property, all of those documents are available to the public and eventually get put in our permanent record file that is available as well.
But that information, at least portions of it, would be available publicly before 2036.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so is that something that people can, if it's not obvious on the map, that they can call some number at the Corps and say, hey, I'm concerned about this piece of property I'm buying. I don't see it identified yet, but it is adjacent to one that is identified. Is there a phone number they can call and get that kind of information?
Yes, sir. That information is on our website. We have had prospective buyers call us before, and we're willing to work with them, as well as we currently work with all the current property owners for sure. And if there's any prospective buyers, we're always open, and that we have before given them information that they needed to help with their decision process.
Yeah, so earlier you had mentioned that you're not aware of any private wells that may be in some of these affected areas. And that would be understandable. We've, been drilling wells in Missouri for a long time, and not all of them are recorded. But has the Corps specifically developed a groundwater modeling program? And do they have monitoring wells installed at strategic places within these affected sites?
Yes, sir. We have an extensive environmental monitoring program that includes groundwater monitoring around specific areas, mostly around the St. Louis Airport site and the Laddie Avenue sites, as well as do surface monitoring in Coldwater Creek. And that's all part of our environmental monitoring data analysis report that we publish annually. And that's just a significant portion of our program that is out there for review, and a lot of data associated with that as far as all of the results from all that groundwater monitoring and any air monitoring that we do around the site.
And you share this regularly with our Department of Natural Resources, I assume?
Yes, sir.
And do you have a regular liaison with our Department of Natural Resources, or someone in your division?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And are you happy with the working relationship you have with our Department of Natural Resources?
Yes, sir. I can definitely say that with Department of Natural Resources and Department of Health and Senior Services with the state agencies, very helpful, and very happy with that coordination.
I was hoping it's okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the answers to your questions there and the opportunity to ask. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So I have Representative Mattison, Representative Prouty, and then we'll have Representative Reuter. Oh, okay.
Good morning. Thank you for being here today to address some of the questions we have. As many Missourians work on your team, I'm certainly curious if you could help talk about the exposure levels that some of your employees or contractors may face, what type of personal protection steps you guys are utilizing to ensure their health and safety while doing remediation.
Great. We've seen that question for sure, and I think that to answer that, with any contaminated site, there are safety precautions that you do take into account. And when the contamination was higher, many years ago, there were more personal protective equipment requirements that were needed. And now, because the contamination is so low level, is the appropriate health and safety precautions are taken. And that's not just an agency decision, that's an overall health and safety decision from our interested Missourians that do work. We have many of them, and they're part of an overall environmental community of practice that take the appropriate precautions when dealing with any of this material.
Very good. And do you guys keep detailed records should any of your employees have health issues that could have been caused by the cleanup efforts?
Yes, sir. And that specifically, that's one of the things that requires of the contractors that do work on site is to make sure that they have a robust health and safety plan, that if any monitoring for their employees is needed, is done.
Very good. I am curious about how groundwater can move any radiologically impacted material. Obviously, it's did a number for years as the material left the airport site, heading up north to Coldwater Creek. But into the areas along the creek, what is the average distance that tests have shown that it has moved away from the creek onto the banks towards the homes?
That's a difficult question to answer without looking at any of the actual reports that we do have out there.
Okay.
To give you an average, I can't give you any specifics. What I can say is that there's definitely a trend of data that we see throughout that contamination that has migrated from the St. Louis Airport site down into Coldwater Creek via various erosion, wind and rain, and then the successive flooding events that has deposited on the banks, as well as any low-lying areas within the floodplain area.
Is there a person within your agency or one of your partner agencies that you could help me get contact information to discuss how groundwater is capable of moving the rim further out?
Oh, yes, sir, for sure. And I guess to answer the question fully from the beginning is we do have a conceptual site model as well as environmental, we do groundwater modeling as part of our overall environmental data and monitoring program to make sure that if there are any areas that we need to target for investigation, that we do those.
Now, whenever you identify an area that needs further testing, is it an Army Corps employee, staff member who does that testing, or do you contract that out? What is the procedure for that actual testing to take place?
The normal procedure for much of the work that we do, it will be an Army Corps of Engineers representative that will oversee contractor actions to go and do that if it's specific sampling that needs to happen.
And what is kind of the turnaround time for when you guys identify the areas that need further testing and actually getting the contractors there to do the testing? Is there a lag time that is clearly identifiable?
It would depend on the site for sure. I will say that where we're at and our contract mechanisms and contractors that we do have in place, that we are able to do that pretty expeditiously. Within a couple weeks time frame, because we already have mechanisms in place to go do that. If you're at a site that does not have those mechanisms in place, it can take months to actually get that in place.
Now, if I'm a resident that lives adjacent to Coldwater Creek, and I can see out my window that there's testing, there's remediation done in a neighbor's yard, what is their procedure, their process? Who do they reach out for to ask for testing done on their property?
For any area that's kind of outside of our authority, we'll definitely, when we have seen those questions before, and that's how, unfortunately, we have to answer those questions is we have a area that we're doing the investigations, we take sampling, and then if the area is outside, then that area outside of our investigation, then there's other avenues that they can look for as far as looking for some of those environmental contractors that we use to come do that sampling.
Sure.
And if there's a possibility of any other agency that can help out in that regard. But for ours, going back to our specific authority and what we're able to do, we do have to adhere to that.
Okay, understand. And I guess I'm very much interested in talking to the person with the best data of the groundwater movement, either within your agency or your partnering agency. Obviously, you know, there's a lot of scientists, a lot of experts working on this. And just to ensure that every potential person who could be, you know, near harm's way, identified or not identified, does have the opportunity to either put their mind at ease to know their property is not being affected, or if it is, and it may just be outside the boundary. I just want to know what the resources are for them, you know, to look out for their own health and safety.
Sure.
All right. Again, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and yield.
And I know we have a few more questions, but one of the things that we're able to do with this committee is have follow-up actions. So I did highlight having some kind of work session. Would you guys be agreeable to having a planned work session where a committee can give you some of our questions in advance, such as the data, and we can come together and review that with you?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Representative Reuter?
Thank you. I just have a few questions, and I'm not real familiar with the radioactive sites, but my county has had lots of issues with lead So, so that's kind of where the perspective I'm coming from. I did notice when you first spoke, you said that it was not the Corps of Engineers' mission to deal with the health aspects. So whose mission is that?
We understand and acknowledge that for sure, that there's a lot of concerns out there from a health perspective. One of the things that we want to make sure is that those individuals are having those conversations with their primary care physician for sure. What we do know that we have had representation over the past with Department of Health and Senior Services, as well as local county health department at some of our public meetings to help with answering some of those questions, because admittedly, we are not the experts in that realm. So we want to make sure that if we do have points of contact and any relationships with those agencies, that we help get those people their answers if they can.
Thank you. And I do know that lead does flow with water, and it sounds like it does the same thing with the radioactive waste. So in Jefferson County, we have lots of floods. And I wonder if there is just a regular practice of retesting those areas once there's been a flood. Do you do that routinely, or must it be requested by the property owner?
We do test the water when we have high flow scenarios to make sure if there's any contamination that is being spread, and we haven't found any. And any time we have a high flow scenario. In addition to that, after 2 years ago, when we had one of the record floods, almost 2 years ago now, in North St. Louis County, we went out and did an extensive effort to go and sample any depositional areas along Coldwater Creek and find out if any contamination would have been moved. And thankfully, we were able to verify that no contamination was spread during that significant flooding event, pointing back to the fact that a lot of the decontamination right now is immobile, and now we have the significant challenge of going and finding that, which we have, and now going and remediating it.
Well, I'm glad that it's immobile. So you also mentioned that you've been working on this project, or the Army Corps has been working on this project for 30 years, right? And that the anticipated completion of the project is 2036 or 2038. But you also mentioned that you were doing this as quickly as possible. Is that really your definition of quickly as possible? I'm just wondering.
Definitely understand and acknowledge that it is a long time frame, and that it's a huge mission that was undertaken many, many years ago. And I want to commend all of those Missourians that have committed a lot of their dedicated lives towards this. We have personnel that have worked on this site that started out of Bowden Spring, that came here and started working on that. Their entire careers have been working on cleaning up the contamination. So we currently have over 120 personnel with Corps and contractors that live around the area that have committed significant amount of time and effort towards this, and taking this opportunity to thank all of those personnel for sure. It's taken a long time, and we understand and acknowledge that. I will say that we are looking at every aspect, as mentioned earlier, to try and see if there's any lessons learned, things that we can incorporate to move faster, for sure. So that's our commitment to the community.
Has there been any technology improvements that have helped you move faster that you found already?
Yes, ma'am. Just depends on, and a lot of those go down to specific engineering or construction aspects of the work in and of itself, that whether it's a specific kind of excavator or a amount of work crew that you're able to do, different work hours, areas, coordination with property owners to get more contamination than we would have otherwise not been able to. A lot of those instances where we're able to go and do that, that's the unfortunate reality of the environmental work, is it does take time to make sure that we're doing it correctly and as in accordance with the actual regulations that we have to follow.
Okay. You mentioned that you had some dedicated contact ways for people to reach the Corps of Engineers with their specific questions about this specific issue, but you didn't share what those are. Do you have a specific location where people can go, and just for the record?
Yes, ma'am. We have a website that has a lot of that information on there, and our contact information is stlfooswrap@usace.army.mil. That's a dedicated email address that anyone can send questions to and help us with our overall communication aspect, because anytime we do get questions, we like to incorporate those in our feedback and our communication to the local community as well.
So how do you, can you just give me the letters one by one, so
Yes,
I
ma'am.
don't get that spelled right?
STLFUSRAP@usace.army.mil.
Thank you. And is there a public telephone number?
Yes, ma'am. 314-260-3905.
Okay. And then you mentioned that there's a point at which you say that it's clear. And I know that with lead, we refer to parts per million, and there's a specific number that is considered in the clear zone, in the safe zone. Do you have that number?
Yes, ma'am.
And what is that?
One of the contaminants of concern that drives a lot of our investigations in Coldwater Creek is thorium-230. That number is 14 picocuries per gram.
Okay, it's 13, what was yours?
Sorry, 14 picocuries per gram.
How do you spell picocuries?
PICOCURIES.
Okay. All right. And I know that there's also a site in Hematite, Missouri that has radioactive waste from the same project. Is that within your scope?
No, ma'am.
So why would that not be in your scope?
Our authority is associated with the Manhattan Engineering District Atomic Energy Commission, those activities, and that would have been a determination a long time ago before me that I cannot speak to.
So where would I go to find information about that?
Unfortunately, I can't give you that information because I'm not as familiar with that site.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Crowder.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My apologies for being late, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and good morning. A few questions just for clarification, and it may very well be because I was late. Representative Mayhew asked about some of the additional testing that may take place, and you stated if the evidence points to the need for additional testing. What evidence would that be?
Yes, ma'am. Any evidence that would be associated with, for instance, trucking logs, pictures associated with areas that may have had fill moved from one area to another. And I would say that our investigation process is not done. It's ongoing. So if there's any pieces of information that would help
How would
us.
I present that information to you? So if I'm a citizen and I have, suspicions or, through my own sleuthing off to the side, I think this is worthy of looking into. What evidence would qualify for you all to say, you know what, yeah, we'll take a look at that? And I'm only asking because, of course, the McDonald Boulevard area through Berkeley going up to Hazelwood, that latter area is all in my district quite specifically. I live in Ferguson, Coldwater Creek traverses through my district. Quite specifically, the airport itself is in my district. And so for those individuals who've been living this for, years and years and years and haven't been heard, what evidence could they provide to you that would, get you to say this is enough? They wouldn't have, I don't know what even you mean by some of the stuff you see.
So, once again, if there's any picture evidence or if there's any trucking logs, that's something that I know that, well, I wasn't part of it, but in the past when they're doing historical records research,
Sure.
there may be something, contractors, contracts that were let out for specific things. Those are areas that would allow us the authority to go and do that investigation, if you will. And it would be great, I would love it if we could just go out and do any investigation that we definitely wanted to, but that's one of the things that I have to answer to is the fiscal part of it and the authority to actually go and do that, just depending on what it is, and definitely not outside the realm for sure, but just want to make sure that that that's part of our specific.
Thank you for that. Also stated, just stated that something about the Army Corps' mission, and I'm assuming your mission as it pertains to this particular project. When you were asked whose mission would be the health part of it, you said the Department of Health and Human Services. I'm trying to be clear on if it's not your mission to deal with the health aspects of that, which I'm sure. Whose is it? Are you implying that the state has some culpability to what took place with this particular project, and so we should kind of focus on them to deal with any type of recuperation of anything when it comes to our health? Is it the state, or is this something, you mean the State Department of Health and Human Services?
Ma'am, I was just referring to the ability to answer questions at some of our, in our public meetings. And there are other agencies that are much more well-equipped to answer those types of questions. Department of Health and Senior Services being one of those to help with the overall understanding and answering questions from the community.
As far as healthcare things are concerned, not necessarily with this project and how their illness may relate to what happened here. And I guess what I'm asking is I can go to my primary care physician and tell me something is a carcinogenic. We're looking, I think, for responsible parties that we can go to and inquire of it. I'm not asking for a diagnosis. I know I have lupus. I want to know, who do I talk to on the federal level that can explain to me the implications of living in toxic waste and what impact it has on my quality of life and prognosis. I understand it was not you, but I also understand there are representatives from the feds that are here, so if someone could, not necessarily now, but sort of identify what federal department would be the responsible party or whose mission it would be to answer that question. But I do recognize and appreciate that I certainly will want to take responsibility for things that aren't necessarily my responsibility to take. The dedicated contact info and website, and I consider myself to be pretty aware of this that's going on. How would, Miss Mary Louise over on Airport Road know how to get in contact with you? What are we doing, not we, but you, doing to ensure that that information is getting out to the mother, single mother of 3 people, works 2.5 jobs, and have no clue what we're talking about, but would find this information pertinent? Because as you're aware, there was a elementary school not far from my district that kids were just going to school with toxic waste to some of them, just having a good old time, regardless of whether the mother is able to go to a meeting at 6 o'clock p.m. Certainly was entitled to that information. How would the lay person find out about it besides you all sending us a nondescript email every now and then that we are supposed to be disseminating to the public? What are you all doing?
Part of our overall commitment to this community is community involvement and having regular update meetings, which will have those virtual update meetings as well as in-person meetings. And anytime that we do those, we send out announcements. So if there are other interested people in the area to be part of that email list, to be part of that overall communication that we send out, and have that opportunity to come meet us in person, or at any point in time, send us questions. If they have questions for specific areas or just overall questions, we're always willing to answer those for sure.
So sure, yes. I'm trying to figure out what in the trenches work that is taking place. Have you all gone to city council meetings? Have you all reached out to a city or a local, government? To quote some of my Republican colleagues, we are representative republic. So I understand that all of us aren't going to be able to go to these meetings. Representatives are, not necessarily state representatives, but it can certainly be the, municipal representatives. Have you all gone to city council meetings? Sent an email or a cute, some kind of attention-grabbing flyer
In the past, we have gone to some specific meetings, most of them being the St. Louis County Council meetings, depending on the scenario that was going in place. There was case in point, a couple of years ago, it was announced about the replacement of McDonough Boulevard Bridge.
So did you go to Berkeley City Council meeting where that would be the most tangible location to have told those people that?
I cannot think of a time, ma'am, of that specifically, and that's just within my tenure.
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure how long you've been there, you can jump in and let me know real quick. How long?
I've been with the Corps of Engineers going on 9 years now.
It's a little bit longer than, I've been elected for 6. So in almost 10 years, no one has popped up at Berkeley City Council meeting and was like, hey, y'all are sitting on Google, or, you know, to tell them anything about beyond what they've heard on the news every now and then. No one has gone, you know, going to city council meeting where an individual represents 700,000 people or something, however many they represent. But not to the city council meeting where these people live around the corner or next door to get that information to their neighbor. Our county councilwoman in the first county council district lives in Bellevue. For sure, but let me finish. What are we doing? Because the public needs to know now. I'm on a public meeting, I'm going to speak for my district, otherwise there's no reason for me to be here. What are we doing to ensure places like Berkeley where the streets are torn up, where they have to still go and find alternative routes to go to work or to get their children? What are we doing to get that information to them? If the answer is nothing today, that's okay. Well, it's not okay. Say that so that we can do a course of action and fix this. So what I'm saying to you is that it's incumbent on the Army Corps, whose mission I'm sure it is when we're talking about being in the community. You can't do that from behind someone. Somebody's gonna have to go to the city council meetings and at least tell these folks so that they can tell their neighbors that something is going on in their community. I should have had come home from session in Jefferson City trying to get home, driving through McDonald Boulevard. It looks like a tornado hit, because I didn't know that you already know something. So that's the point I would like to make then, and I'll yield for now, but I also would be remiss if I didn't throw out, it's a shame, and I'm not sure who can also speak to me about the fact that Pruitt-Igoe wasn't included in the record language that Senator Hawley put forth. I'm gonna assume that was an oversight by accident, but for anyone in here who can walk me through that process, that would be incredible, and I'll yield for now, thank you.
Thank you for answering all of our questions. I know that all of us have questions we'd like to follow up with, especially the communication piece. I think that's something that we can have some tangible results and work as a team to maybe come up with some good communication. I wanted to remind you to leave your witness form. If you don't have it completed, you can leave it with Valerie over there next to the exit. And that concludes your time. Thank you so much for being here answering those questions. Next, I would like to call up the DNR, and there's several seats here, and maybe you can decide who should be the spokesperson. Nice, I see that we have one. Thank you.
I may need help, but my name is TJ Braden, Missouri Department of Natural Resources. Happy to answer any questions that you have.
Can you talk a little bit louder into the
Yes.
mic? I'm sorry.
Better?
Yeah, that's better.
So happy to answer any questions that you have. Don't know where you want to start.
Okay, so one of the things that I've recently heard about, because I know about the sites that are in North County, St. Louis, and I'm well aware of Weldon Spring because of going to school and living in that area. But it's just recently come to my attention that there's actually 11 sites that are part of the energy, it's called EOI CPA. And I'm going to have somebody come up and just give me an overview. I do need their name, so if I could, oh, okay, I will have you come up next to go over that. But we need to talk about all of these other sites as well. The one that I know about is Francis Hall being next to Weldon Spring. One of my concerns that I have is in doing some research, it found that Burgmeister Spring was sort of a litmus test for what was going on at that site, because if people don't know, not only was that a nuclear enrichment facility, I have documentation that their transuranics were at that site. recycled uranium, which brought plutonium to that site. And a lot of those informations, and if you don't have that documentation, it's very difficult to uncover documentation in this program because it came from a time of secrecy. And nobody in this room was there, when this was all created, but it's very hard for us to go back and dig this paperwork. From the best of my knowledge, I cannot find any testing after 2002 on any of the creeks. We already know that creeks that had materials dumped into them made people very ill, and that was documented. But we had a production plant that straight up dumped barrels and barrels into the streams and creeks in that area. Can you tell me, is there any current testing other than surface, because I don't really trust surface testing on something like this? Do you currently know, and I'm gonna even say that, I don't expect people to have these questions necessarily, but I do appreciate that we have the ability to sit down and work on these things. So currently, are you aware of any documentation of all those creeks and streams coming out of that TNT area and the nuclear area out of Weldon?
So without specifying what all of those streams are, yes, there's significant monitoring, surface water monitoring, groundwater monitoring that's being conducted now and has been since 2002, 2003 under the Legacy Management Program, long-term stewardship, monitoring of the selected remedy for the second operable unit or the groundwater operable unit from the Logan Springs site. Those results are published annually.
And that's coming off of the Superfund site, correct? Whatever's leaching from the
Weldon
Superfund.
Spring, yes. So the remedy for the groundwater there is monitored natural attenuation, so there has to be significant monitoring for an extended period of time to confirm that levels are reducing at the rates that they'd be expected to.
Okay. And then what I'm asking is a little step beyond that. I've been told by a person that now works for the Department of Energy prior to that position that Darting Creek had material dumped directly into them and some of those creeks in there, and that they haven't seen any real testing for Darting Creek and some of those other creeks like Femi Osage. Do we have any testing of those creeks?
I need to go back and look at the long-term monitoring reports. I know those creeks are mentioned. I don't recall specifically which metrics are being evaluated in those.
Because it's hard to find the documentation, and it's, to the best of my knowledge, I haven't really found any documentation so that we can just ensure our constituents across Missouri that we've checked those boxes.
And is it Darden and Femi Osage are the two that you're most concerned about?
There's several creeks that are around there, and we need to look at several of them. We have Representative West that might have some additional questions on that. The other question I have is, we have people who are on wells in southern St. Charles County. And what is disturbing to me is the Weldon Spring plant had a sister plant, Fernald, Ohio. And the state of Ohio was very aggressive in cleaning that up and informing their people. And they received almost $90 million in compensation to their residents. Meanwhile, and I do have documentation on it, the people of St. Charles County had a Department of Energy funded PR campaign pulled on them because they wanted to keep the kids at Francis Howell 1,000 feet from that site on site because they didn't want to create fear. The reason why is 70,000 homes were fed by the quarry that was used as a nuclear waste dump. I was one of the students who swam in that. Several of my friends who did have died. It really concerns me because all of these folks that we talk about, we've had a conversation with the EPA, and that's definitely going to be something we follow up with them on. We don't have a really good handle as representatives of whether the people have been communicated what's in their well, how to ensure testing, whether they own it or it's tested in the future. They also deserve the right to have somebody come forward and tell them how they can protect themselves with filters. But we can't find anybody, possibly because of fear of lawsuit, that is willing to provide them any information. So that's definitely the wells, the groundwater, the communication, these are all gonna be part of our follow-up actions. But can you speak to any anything that we could provide the public that you know of now about our wells?
So for the Weldon Spring site specifically, there's a large area that has an institutional control on it where wells are not permitted. The groundwater there cannot be used for wells. Outside of that, I apologize, this is a frustrating answer. Private drinking water wells are not within the Department of Natural Resources authority to address, so I don't mean to punt to somebody else, but it's outside of our authority, so I can't speak to that.
The honesty is what's helpful. So if you don't have the authority to provide information, we need to know that, because then we can go back and tell our constituents that the state is not really monitoring. They have to take a greater ownership. The thing that I then struggle with is to tell a family who believes that they're harmed or impacted, or they see their neighbor, which is alarming as well, and they don't have anywhere to go where somebody is willing to step up and give them the answers. So thank you for saying no. You're saying that if it's outside that immediate Superfund site, you really don't have the authority to review or keep track of the people on private wells.
The Missouri Department of Natural Resources specifically.
I'll ask DHSS, but do you know, does DHSS?
I would defer to them.
Okay, then we'll have them. Okay, do I have any other questions? Representative Prouty?
Good morning.
Good morning.
So really quickly, is there's a fund, and I'm searching for it furiously, I should have been, you know where I'm going, right? Y'all gonna ask for some money this year?
I have not seen the governor's recommended budget this year.
Just because we kind of don't have a, you know,
That's a good point. So I can't answer that question right now. What I can give you an update though, so we haven't had any communities reach out and request
I mean,
that.
because we don't know that it's there for the public, let's go back. So there's a fund, and just jump in when you feel led. There's a fund that has existed for some time now that through appropriations, I happen to sit on the committee on budget, through appropriations, we could put some money in there so that communities, same question you were asking, Madam Chair, so that communities can request from the Department of Natural Resources come and, you know, test things. Certainly would be helpful to the previous gentleman that testified for sure. Maybe that would serve as some evidence that we could present to the Army Corps so that they can, you know, start to test. The problem with that is for years and years, the department never asked for any money.
Mhm.
Inasmuch, there was never any money really in the fund. Communities did not know that this fund existed or that this was a thing that they could even do, but because we didn't appropriate any money, because no one ever asked for any, even if a community wanted to ask for the test, well, no money.
Mhm.
We recently asked for money. Is it money in there now?
There's money in there now,
About how much, 100 grand?
$150,000.
150 grand, so for the last 3 years, we got, I think the max is what, 50 grand a year, 50 grand a.
So the maximum used to be $150,000 total appropriated per year. And I believe that's been upgraded to $300,000 a year.
Yeah, I had an amendment, I didn't offer it, because, you know, it's budget time, and people, yeah, no. You know how that goes. Though I never had an amendment bill, I should have tried, to get rid of the cap. But, you know, I'm a Democrat, but a fiscal conservative one, so I understand why that was a no. Notwithstanding, the community does not know that that fund exists, and that is a thing that they can do. So I asked you the same question I asked the previous gentleman, what are we, because we're the state, what are we doing to ensure that the community knows that this is a thing, so that, you know, as Madam Chair was saying, she can tell our community that this is something that they can apply for, and that we can get them the testing that they need, so perhaps they can present it to the Army Corps if they're not getting the remediation. Like all of these things, you know, we can work together to get these folks what they need, but again, there has to be some kind of trust, honesty, and information being put out there, which is why, you know, I think the community is so frustrated, because we all could be doing just a little bit more. I'll say this, of course, these issues aren't necessarily our fault. We took a job, so they're our responsibility. So we don't have to keep giving qualifiers of us not being there when it happened. No one cares. What they do know is that we are now responsible, I am responsible, because people don't know that this natural resources fund exists. I take responsibility for that. I could be doing more. One of my favorite movies about, service workers. The gentleman said that, you know, the difference between ordinary and extraordinary is that little extra. We can strive to be extraordinary by just simply telling people that these things exist. It's their money. We should certainly be making good on their investment by merit of their labor paid through taxes. That said, what are we doing to tell them that this money exists?
So with the $150,000 appropriation into the radioactive waste investigation fund, a big concern from the department's perspective is the ability of that amount of money to do many investigations. We figured 3 maximum,
Sure.
and those would be probably bare bones investigations.
Sure.
So the concern and the reason that we have not advertised this significantly is that we would get so many requests that we would be unable to either sort through them in an expeditious manner or otherwise administer the funds in an effective way.
What I'm hearing is that it would be helpful for those of us who serve on budget to grow the fund.
Or to talk to your communities as well. If you have a community who, because it has to be requested by a local government.
Sure. So that would be something applicable, like, Representative Rowe was saying, there's a community that's not in the immediate St. Louis area that would absolutely be, we know that, you know, Ninja Turtles are running around the 73rd district because of all the taps and waste. But there are other places that can absolutely benefit from this, who need this information to take to the Army Corps or whatever we need to do for it. And so I hear you on that. This is something I'm happy to talk with you offline on, and what we need to do legislatively to make sure that you all can do your part for our people. I appreciate you. Thank you so much. That's House Bill 6, right? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate you being here today, and I especially want to thank you in the partnership that and help that you have given me as I attempted to amend the radioactive waste investigation fund from how I originally wrote it in 2018 to where I hope it goes in the future. Unfortunately, the person who held your position before you tried to stop that fund from being created, and I still haven't passed. But that's beside the point. Now, one of the key aspects of the amendments that I was trying to do to that program is to add groundwater testing to that, because it's such a concern of mine on how, you know, radiologically impacted material is traveling through the waterways. Who is the #1 person in the Department of Natural Resources who focuses on groundwater movement? Who can I specifically talk to about that?
Just groundwater movement in general?
Yes.
It'd be somebody in the Missouri Geologic Survey. I'd have to take a kind of.
Are they under your department?
Yes.
Okay. And who is within your department in charge of custodians of records, analyzing the data, keeping it recorded through the legacy waste management? In your opening statements, you say it's somebody within the DNR who tracks the data from those groundwater wells?
So all of the sites that we've discussed today are sites that are led by federal agencies. So the primary tracking, documentation, and analysis is all done by either EPA, U.S. Army Corps, or Department of
I should
Energy.
rewind my question, because when we initially started talking about the area around the Francis House site. Is the DNR responsible for any monitoring around that site? Or is
No.
that strictly on the federal level?
Federal level.
Are they sharing all of that data with your agency specifically?
Yes, and in fact, there was another person who was maybe going to be joining us today from the department who's out conducting split sampling or observation of groundwater sampling related to, I believe, the Weldon site today. So there is collaboration and interaction there, although
Who is that?
David Canningsfeld. There's David.
It's a bit late.
Would you like to come up?
Yeah,
Very-
that was quick. You got it all the way from
Could you please state your name?
David
and address?
Koningsfeld.
Do you represent?
I'm with the Department of Natural Resources Federal Facilities Section, and I'm the state project manager for the Weldon Spring site cleanup oversight.
Very good. I got a feeling we're going to spend a lot of time together in the very near future. You know, it's interesting. I opened up Twitter, whatever it's called now, this morning, and the DNR had tweeted out a link to all of their maps. And, you know, I was impressed with the amount of maps on the website that talk about geological, you know, attributes and groundwater, springs, things like that. Are you directly responsible for creating more maps or keeping that up to date?
I would be responsible for keeping updates on the Weldon Spring entries on our DNR eStart,
Sure.
which has most of our sites listed in an abbreviated fashion. As far as I'm aware, we don't maintain a separate site-specific map for the Weldon Spring site.
Okay. However, I would assume the DNR has done studies on groundwater flow through that area, though. Both on the
Yes.
north side, south side, bush wildlife potential area, and further west. Okay. Because there's a lot of data. We don't, you know, obviously I don't expect you to have data with you. I just want to know who my resource is as we take a look at the area around that. Because a lot of that water flows from that area right into my district. So when I'm looking out for my constituents, I just need to know who my partners are going to be for that. One thing I'm going to be reaching out for is more specifics of what a good testing plan would look like, as there are some concerns on potential contamination that may be leaching into my district. And I just feel it's a proper role of government to be proactively looking out for potential hazards so that we can keep the future of Missourians safe. So thank you very much for being here, and I look forward to working with you.
Thank you.
Representative Mayhew?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple of questions for you. I'm glad you came up here because you're probably going to get most of these. So on this, we have several different sites. Is MDNR doing any separate monitoring outside of what the Corps is already doing on any of these sites or all?
I can speak to the Weldon Spring site. We're taking split samples to verify the lab results independently. That's the main action we do in addition to looking at all the reports DOE submits to make sure everything is done according to the work plans and regulations they have to follow. Can't speak to the others.
So David, you've got Weldon Springs, so TJ, are we aware of, do we do any testing on the other ones separate from what the Corps is already doing?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay, so we are doing a little bit of checking the checker at Weldon, but we're not sure on the remaining sites, or we know we're not on the other ones.
In the past, for the few FUSRAP sites, there was a cooperative agreement between the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Missouri Department of Natural Resources, in which the Army Corps provided funding for the type of oversight activities that David's discussing on the Weldon Springs site. That agreement lapsed in 2018 or 2019. We've been in discussions and I think are making progress on reaching a new agreement, but since that agreement has lapsed, I don't think there's been any sort of oversight, the type of which David has discussed so far on the PTRAP sites.
So my concern is that, and I don't have any data on this, but that it appeared, at least by some of the reporting on it, that there was appeared to be a rush by the federal government to clear these sites and get them off their books. But we are doing our due diligence, right, as the state to make sure that, you know, we're not speeding up the process to the extent that we might be exposing Missourians to future hazards with these sites, right? We're being diligent about that.
Well, the authorizing statute, CERCLA, it's an entirely federal statute. There is no state equivalent to the CERCLA statute, so we've got federal entities operating under a federal statute where the department has provided oversight in the past, but there is no complementary mechanism other than the federal statute to authorize us to do any other work.
Well, other than, we, as the state of Missouri and the government of the state of Missouri has a duty to the citizens of the state of Missouri, regardless of who the person is who might be responsible for our injury, up to and including the federal government in all of their different various forms, right? But what I want to be comfortable with is that MDNR is not looking at it like it has a federal problem and then allowing the federal government to do whatever it is the federal government wants to do to say, yeah, we're all good to go there. I mean, we're doing our part, right, to protect Missourians, because that's our primary concern, correct?
So we're working within our existing statutory authority to do what we can to provide certainty to the citizens of Missouri that remedial actions are being undertaken in an appropriate manner.
Okay, so do we need further statutory authority from the state of Missouri in order to make sure that we are doing everything we can to protect Missourians?
There is no state equivalent to the Comprehensive Environmental Response Liability and Compensation Act, under which all of these sites are being, not all of them, most of these sites are being remediated.
So without creating another state department, we may need to discuss what we can do to further make sure that we're doing everything as the government of the state of Missouri to protect our citizens. We have a specific interest there. Okay, so then that probably answers my next question. So is MDR doing any separate monitoring? Do you guys utilize their wells for their monitoring wells for your own testing of this? We were talking about a split sample of Weldon Springs. Those kind of things, do we have a separate ongoing investigation process, or is it none? Okay. So any of the work that perhaps David's doing, is that's a separate line in the budget? Is that correct?
So that'll be part of, every year there's a state obligation related to Superfund sites. Superfund circular are synonymous, or one's part of the other rather. So the responsible party at a surplus site is the one who compensates the investigative agencies, and in this case it's the Department of Energy, federal. So you'll see that Superfund obligation line in the budget, and that's where all that is.
Yeah, I've seen that before. Wasn't exactly sure what part of, is it our people directly who are accessing that money? Is it separate equipment that we use, or is it just simply analysis that we use that money for?
It's a lot of things. It's statutorily required, so there's a state cost share obligation. The federal government is putting in 90% of the cost on the Superfund remediation projects, and then the state pays 10%.
Okay. We talked a little bit about private wells and who's responsible for them, permitting, et cetera. So who is responsible for permitting private wells? Or is there a permit process for private wells?
So there's well construction guidelines and reporting requirements that you're aware of. Well construction is the Department of Natural Resources. From the health aspect.
Including private wells?
Including private wells.
Okay.
Well, it's drilled. But as far as regulation of the water that comes from a private well, that is not the Department of Natural Resources, it is the Department of Health and Senior Services.
And in fact, they don't necessarily, and we'll let them answer the question, but they don't have a testing regimen that they put private wells through that you're aware of.
I'm not familiar.
Okay, but I'll ask them that question when I get there. We talked about this money available to cities to request the testing on there. And you'll recall my question to you in committee was, it seemed like a pretty small number. And you're aware, of course, and I mentioned it then, that I'm an engineer by trade, and that I was involved in one of these very extensive and, by the way, expensive groundwater monitoring and modeling program for a particular community in the state. And this 20 years ago, and 150 grand didn't even touch what we spent on that program. So that was my concern about whether or not we actually had enough money in that program in order to be able to effectively do that. But I think what I'm hearing is that even after we discussed it, nobody's taken advantage of that. I wonder why that is. Why? Because I'm hearing a lot of concerns, seeing a lot of reporting up here. Is it simply that these communities are unaware that we have this ability to do this, or is it that they don't feel like they need it, or can you even speculate on that?
I wouldn't want to speculate.
Okay, so it sounds to me like we might need public education effort on this particular thing. So in the Weldon Springs, back to you, David, if you don't mind. In the Weldon Springs area, there's probably some groundwater monitoring wells. So are those also being utilized for remediation? Are we pumping and treating? Or is it simply that the Corps and/or whoever is just using it to monitor the direction of the plume?
The groundwater remediation, the remedy selected for the groundwater at Weldon Spring is natural attenuation, monitored natural attenuation. So we're sampling to make sure that the levels are decreasing at the expected rate. But the mechanism of that attenuation is primarily hydrodynamic dispersion.
Excuse me, as the chair, I do know you need to define and give people what natural attenuation means.
Yep, so Madam Chair, I was getting ready just to poke him on that one. I'm pretty familiar with what you're talking about, but you might want to put that in layman terms, what natural remediation is and attenuation, and so I'll let you go ahead and do that.
So natural attenuation would be the tendency for the amount of contaminants to decrease over time. With a lot of contaminants, they break down chemically over time. Uranium is not one of those. It's a metal, it's stable. So the main mechanisms of attenuation that affect uranium is some of that uranium precipitates or adsorbs to the material in the ground and sticks to the rock. And otherwise, the water is just diluted through natural flow, and accordingly, the amount of uranium in the water decreases.
But we're not relying on the half-life of U-235 in order to clean up the problem.
No, natural radioactive decay would not meet a cleanup standard in a reasonable time frame. It would take on the order of thousands of years. The defined reasonable time frame for cleanup is 100 years at the Weldon Spring site.
So but we are satisfied that this natural attenuation is suitable to at least keep the contaminant within that local area. That groundwater movement is not going to sufficiently move this contaminated material beyond the location of where the contamination occurred.
Yes, not to a degree that would put the public health at risk.
Okay, so being very familiar with how groundwater moves through the groundwater system in Missouri, how can we say that confidently?
There is some uncertainty due to the karst behavior, arcades and stuff, but the extensiveness of the monitoring network and monitoring some key points, like in particular Burgermeister Spring, is the eventual outfall of a large majority of the groundwater that is affected will eventually end up at the spring. That's kind of our last, not our last, but one of the primary points we monitor to make sure it captures a lot of the groundwater that tends to flow in that direction.
But we have a rigorous enough model to be reasonably confident that the plume is not migrating, or at speed anyway, beyond where we've identified it now.
Correct.
Okay. And that monitoring will continue on into the future, forever, what?
Most likely in perpetuity. The
Okay.
scope of that monitoring may decrease over time as the plume decreases in size, but because of the nature of uranium, it's most likely to continue in perpetuity.
And forgot to ask the gentleman before, but he said picocuries. So they, and if you can answer this, please do, but if you don't, that need to refer it on, then that's fine too. Is the amount of picocuries he's talking about, is that an average X-ray, or is that laying in the sun for a week? What was that exposure limit? What would that be? Can you inform on that?
I'm not particularly familiar with the unit of picocuries. I was trained by school as a nuclear engineer, but we mostly worked in different units. Picocuries are more a measure of health exposure, which was kind of tangential to my training. I can't speak to that.
I'm gonna confess that this is the first time I've heard that term, so picocurie seems small, but, and it certainly has to do with radiation, but I was just wondering if what that exposure limit, what is that equivalent to? So maybe Department of Health can help me out with that one too.
I want to add one point of clarification. In comments to the 2021 5-year review for the Weldon Springs site, the department noted the potential need for additional groundwater monitoring wells to ensure an adequate network and adequate modeling of groundwater flow. We are in the process of deciding where those wells are going to go now. We're working with the Department of Energy and EPA to cite those wells to address the concerns that were raised in our comments on the last 5-year review for that site.
And thank you for that, because I thought that you and I had some conversations about that in the past. And so when do we expect either the plan or the execution of the plan? When's that?
I do not have a good timeline.
There should be substantial movement by the next 5-year review. Their goal is to resolve the issues from a 5-year review before the next one. The next one is in 2026, I believe. The issues may not be entirely resolved by then, but there will certainly be updates provided in the next 5-year review report on the status and plans moving forward.
But sooner than the half-life of uranium-235. Okay. Now that's all I have right now. Yield back to the chair, and with the proviso that I might have a question or two before it's done.
And I have more questions, but I'm going to call on Representative West.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I currently represent this whole area of Weldon Spring. I know the issue here is much larger than Weldon Spring, but I'm just going to speak to Weldon Spring here real quickly. First, I want to revert back to the program in which you have money for testing. Okay, you said it applies to local governments. Is that to townships? Is that cities? Is it counties only? I need to know who can apply for this, and in your knowledge, if I have a community that is a township, they're basically all on well water, and the incidence of cancer are extremely high, would your department consider that money to be used for an investigation of that location?
I mean, so this is governed by statute. This is 260.558 RSO. I don't think the conditions at a particular location, unless we got so many requests that we couldn't fulfill them all, would be considered. But the language is just upon written request by a local governing body expressing concerns of radioactive waste contamination in a specified area within its jurisdiction, and then the department shall investigate, basically. So there is a provision later that says we'll prioritize, if necessary, shall prioritize requests in the order in which they were received. So in that case, the situation with a high incidence of cancer rate would not be considered. It'd just be the order that requests were received, but
So
those
apparently right now you don't have any requests, correct?
no requests.
Okay. Also, I want to go back a little bit. I know you've gone over this, but I'm a pretty simple person, so I need simple explanations. On the private wells, okay, my district is riddled with these. DNR is not responsible for the testing of those wells. Okay, so I guess it would be incumbent upon the individual to do the testing. So if the individual finds out that they are damaged, now we're talking well water, which is a movement of water underneath, not necessarily the damage of any property above that, just the water that's coming out of the well. And they find out that the well is contaminated. First of all, who bears that responsibility of cleanup, of notification, of the whole list of things that we have to do to make that a known site for, and then ultimately, who bears responsibility of the person who is damaged because now his property has a tainted well on it.
So this would all be the responsible party for the contamination, and responsible party is kind of a term of art within CERCLA. It's the entity that either transported or disposed, whatever. There can be multiple responsible parties, but that's who it would be. The tricky part would be attribution of the particular harm to the responsible party's actions. The way that would be addressed depends on how the contamination would be discovered, where it is. So if it were close enough to a known site, perhaps there would just be an operable unit of the site that would be expanded. If it were a significant amount of contamination that required a different remedy than what had been in place previously, then the record of decision might need to be amended. That's a very long process, but it depends on what contamination is discovered, where it is, and the extent of it, and its relation to the other
So you
sites.
just said something that concerns me. It's a very long process. Meanwhile, the person doesn't have well water or access to well water. Their property is damaged. How do they continue on? And I know that's sort of what we're trying to figure out here. Does the state bear any responsibility or any assistance for this property owner?
I'm not aware of any mechanisms that would provide well water or drinking water. You know, there's emergency water available in some situations, but short of something like that, no, I'm not familiar with any remedies that would be available.
So David, some questions for you. I'm sure you're very familiar with the quarry over at the Welland Spring site. It seemed like they just scooped off what they could on top and filled it in with clean dirt, and then they left it and say, don't disturb. Is that a rough or a quick, correct analysis of what they did there?
They excavated down to preliminary remediation goals. They set a level that said, material that is less radioactive than this is acceptable to stay in this area, and they dug everything out until they reached those goals. And then they filled it in with clean backfill, of course. Generally speaking, yes, but they did set goals that were scientifically based to try to clean up too.
So for some of the documents and things that we have, it was a pretty hot area for just a mix of things. Is there any concerns that what was left behind, while maybe they thought they had gotten to their goal, but any concerns about that bleeding down into the groundwater and be dispersed out in groundwater, maybe not above ground, but the groundwater being dispersed out to other areas where it's sucked up as a private well or even a semi-private well, later on down the line, and it's sucked up and now it's brought back into contamination. You're the water movement guy. Is there any concerns about this?
There is an extensive groundwater monitoring network in and around the quarry as well as the chemical plant area. So any migration of contaminants that isn't already known would be detected and action would be taken prior to it affecting public individuals.
Then my last question is, we talked about as this contamination gets in these stream beds or has gotten into the stream beds, that we hope that the hard metals drop to the stream bed and the clean water moves on so that we're not spreading the contamination. And I'm sure you're going to tell me we do testing on the stream beds too, but my concern is, okay, we have water coming up to the ground source as it's moving on. The hard metals are dropping into the stream source. It might be cleaner downstream a little bit. Are we still maintaining and testing our stream beds closer to the ground where the water comes out of the ground and gets into the now we're talking about above ground water, such as streams and ponds and lakes? Is there, I'm sure there's continuous testing going on, but is there a threat now that it's into this, and then as it floods, as we get larger rains or whatever, this gets moved down a little bit more and dispersed further out?
There, as far as I'm aware, is not a continuous monitoring plan for the sediment in the streams, but the sediment was sampled during remediation and
How long ago was that?
more than that, 2000, in the 2003 area.
So since 2003, we don't think the stream beds have been tested?
Representative West, I'm gonna jump in here. The vendors left in 2002, so some of that would have had to happen in the late 90s. Also, I think it's just time for me to call out on this particular issue. That groundwater monitoring wells have expanded over time. And in the 2021, we've talked about that particular report. DNR expressed frustration with their lack of response in adding additional wells, and also noted that we're having rising levels outside the scope of those wells. Additionally, they were wondering why it was expanding, and they also were pretty detailed about how disappointed they were that they were not reaching their goals. And I just have to say that, because if I was just listening to this conversation, it sounds like they did a great job, the cleanup's going well, we're monitoring regularly, and everything's fine. But that's not what you would read if you read the raw comments from DNR in 2021. And the 5-year review from that sounds like it's written by a very concerned resident. Now, ultimately, what just gets published is a ridiculous polishing of everything's fine. So I just wanted to, before we go down this road, we have to acknowledge, we're talking about a limestone quarry, we're talking about karst property, and we are saying that DNR did in fact say they are missing their goals, and for over 8 years, the Department of Energy was not responsive to DNR. So part of my follow-up, and maybe do we need a state CERCLA law or something like that?
I think that's a very big question that deserves significant discussion. CERCLA is a huge law. It's something that shouldn't be taken on lightly, but if it's something you're thinking about, I would be happy to provide
Then let's
information.
talk about that. We haven't even touched base with the fact that, I, being pretty well versed, did not realize the full scope of 11 sites are being paid out by a federal compensation program. So we need to revisit, Representative Matison's gonna have a conversation, Representative Prouty's gonna have a conversation. We all need that conversation. We have representatives, and I'm not even sure Representative Crossley knows how bad his area is, or the proximity he is. So, that being said, I'll wrap it up. But we do need to acknowledge that DNR did not agree that they were meeting their goals, because we are having testimony that sounds as if they are, and I
So we
think
have,
that's a lot.
I have to clarify, we have agreed that in all the 5-year reviews, that the remedies overall are protective of human health and the environment. We've noted deficiencies, and if you go back in time, the further back you go on 5-year reviews, I think the harsher our comment letters
Yes.
are. We have noted deficiencies, but we have not ever not concurred that the remedy is protective.
Right, so what they finally said is, for now it's safe, but it does not seem to be meeting their goals for cleanup.
We've expressed concerns about the rate of attenuation.
And then the attenuation, I want to make that very clear. In layman's terms, that means let God take care of it. Just let it flow, evaporate, and dissipate.
It's not an active process.
Right. Okay, thank you. Representative West, were you done with your questioning? Because I think I jumped in.
I'll do my time.
Okay. Representative May.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So if I got that last exchange right, we're not excited about the rate of progress at Weldon Springs.
In an area that is on DOE property, really right where the former source area was, there is no discernible trend, so it's not going to attenuate within a 100-year time frame as far as the data shows we have. We were asking for additional wells in that area. Those comments are related to an entirely on-site area and isn't affecting outside property at this time.
You might have led with that.
Yeah, sorry.
So what I'm hearing is that we could probably stand with a little more cooperation from the federal government on this particular issue, realizing, of course, it's still on their property. But it sounds to me like we may have some concern that there's at least a reasonable possibility that it might not stay there. Is that a safe assumption from what I heard, or am I stretching it a bit?
There's no reason to expect that the most contaminated area that's not attenuating would travel off-site. It's an issue with the cleanup goals that were established. So the state's issues were more with the fact that DOE does not have enough data to show that they're meeting the goals they agreed to in the remedy.
But with an eye toward the potential for that getting outside their boundary, right? That's what our concern is.
It's
Correct.
It was in Bushwhack.
So the, whether or not they're meeting their goals is a primary concern of ours.
Yes.
And to that specific problem of if they're not meeting their goals now, then there's not a whole lot of expectation unless from communication with you guys that they modified their remediation process. So did they do that based on your comments?
They came up with some actionable recommendations, and a working group was established with the national labs and the state and EPA, all worked together to come up with some actionable items, which they have since been implementing. And we've made progress on resolving the issues, but it hasn't been quite resolved yet.
Okay, so we've made progress with agreeing to a process.
Yes.
Okay, well, that doesn't sound like that's fixing the problem. So is all these meetings gonna result in actionable things that they are actually going to implement and put into place in our lifetime? And I'm not jumping on you, I'm curious about, and maybe that we should have not let the Corps guy get out of here so quick, but the reality is that, and he hit the door pretty quick there. But my point is that we can talk about all the deficiencies with the monitoring program or the remediation program, but what are we going to get to a point sooner or later where we're going to tell them, you guys got to do this because this stuff is getting dangerously close to being outside their boundary or whatever? So is that, and have we put an imperative on them that maybe we need to get to a decision so we can get to an action item here on this?
Yes, the issues being recognized in the 5-year review does put some, I don't know the right word, some sort of obligation on the federal party to resolve those issues. And we do have the opportunity to concur or not concur with the 5-year review when issued. So those issues would need to be resolved, most likely to our satisfaction as well as EPA's.
So is there anything that would make them do that?
We're operating under an entirely federal law.
Thank you.
Representative, a quick clarifying question. TJ, when we looked at this 2020 review, the original notes from DNR, it did say that it was outside the boundaries. Because we keep saying, well, it's not outside the boundaries. But I think if you could look at the original documentation for MoDNR asked, why was it outside the boundaries? So I really think this is a perfect example of how we need to come together on this, because my understanding is that DNR believed they were missing their goals. It is outside their boundaries, yet the presentation, your understanding is it's within the boundary. You know, it's just, I feel like we have a different understanding.
I don't know if we're talking about the same thing.
Well, he said right now, the monitoring wells are containing everything on site, and the original source materials have not gone off site. But as I understand that, that's not true, because one of the statements asked, why was the uranium in bush wildlife. And I also say, well, then get the Army Corps in here and get that uranium out of our fishing lakes. So I would just like to be met at the same level of concern I have for Missourians. And telling these cameras that it hasn't gone off site is not factual based on my reading of that last 2021 report.
And so the monitoring wells do not capture anything, they're not recovery wells, they're just there to allow us to take samples.
So can you speak to that part of, if we're telling the public that it hasn't gone off site, then why is it in bush wildlife?
So that's why I think we're talking about different things. So I think David was talking about a specific area of concern where we want more monitoring wells, and I don't.
Okay,
think
so
that we're meeting
I
here.
thought I was gonna ask it really, just to clarify. And the reason why there's confusion is because there's what DNR agreed to write on the final report and what DNR originally commented on. In 2021, DNR originally commented that they needed more monitoring wells because it was, the material was not decreasing as expected. And there was also questions of why was the material being found off-site at higher levels in bush wildlife? Question mark. I mean, do you know what I'm talking about?
I know the comment letter you're talking about, I don't have it in front of me, I don't dispute anything.
That, you know what, that's fair, so let's have a follow-up, because I believe that this next 5-year review is one of the only areas we have to pull a lever. And I want to support you guys. When you ask for more monitoring wells, I don't want to find out by stumbling across documents that you've been asking for 8 years. I've come across documentation where you've been asking for testing in bush wildlife for fish and you've been asking for years to no response. So I want to empower you guys that you have our support, that if the federal government is not doing their job, if they're not responsive to you, and I know they even took budget away from you, and I want everyone to realize that the federal government used to pay them to be an oversight, and then they pulled out their budget and they're not answering their questions. So let's have a work session on how we can empower our state agencies to ring that bell and come to us when there's a problem, and how we can stand behind you to fight for Missourians. And with that, I'm done with my simple question. Who else did we? Representative Mayhew.
Madam Chair, may I complete my inquiry, please? And thank you for that. You saved me a few questions in that exchange there. So, if I understood correctly, that we have raised these concerns, at least in the previous 5-year, right? We got another 5-year coming up in 2026. You're going to make some more recommendations, apparently some of them being repeated from previous 5-year things. So is there anything that you're aware of that would allow the federal government to continue yawning at our suggestions and continuing on doing whatever it is they feel like they need to do? Because knowing full well how groundwater moves in this type of geology, 5 years could be nothing, or 5 years could be a lifetime. But things change really quick, especially in shallow groundwater, right? And I'm thinking that 5 years is, I mean, I'm glad one's coming up in 2026, but if we're making the same recommendations only to hear the same thing from the federal government and them not responding to us, is there anything that we can do to put pressure on them to respond to our comments?
Specifically at the Weldon Springs site, we have, as a state, been officially recognized as one of the regulators in the federal facility agreement, but that is a site-specific document and wouldn't apply in a general sense to other sites. But we can go to dispute resolution with the DOE if we don't agree on really any report we receive at any time. So if we have concerns from an annual report, we can immediately take that to dispute resolution under the federal facility agreement. I'll have to let TJ answer on the other sites more generally.
So that sounds to me like that involves lawyers and courts, which can take a little while. Okay, well, thank you very much, and I think that there must be something that we can do, perhaps not legislatively, but certainly from from the executive branch of our government to perhaps put some pressure on them. This troubles me because I have just heard how cooperative everyone was, and come to find out that, well, maybe their definition of cooperative is a little bit different than our definition. Thank you very much, I appreciate that. I do have a few questions that I would like to chat about offline, and then we'll make that discussion available to the rest of the committee if you don't mind. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Poirier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So let's talk a little bit about this dispute resolution that you just referenced. Is that something that's contractual? Is it overseen by a contract?
I'm unfamiliar with the dispute resolution process. I'd be happy to
Okay.
follow up with you offline.
That would be great. I'd like to know if that's considered some sort of arbitration or if it's something else. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions from the committee? I know this is gonna lead into a whole nother hour of conversation, so I'm gonna just say that Westlake, I believe, is a significant issue, and there's currently no cleanup plan for Westlake. Is that correct? They're working on a plan.
So the Westlake, that's operating under CERCLA as well. The Westlake initial record of decision was 2008. So the record of decision is when the entity doing the remediation has selected what they're going to do. There was a record of decision amendment in 2018, and I believe there's ongoing investigation. So there has been a plan, but that plan has been modified and may be modified again in the future.
And is that because that site has leached, rolled off, whatever word we're gonna use, that there is significant damage that is rolled outside the original containment area? I know I'm using those words wrong, so please correct me.
My understanding of the Westlake site is that that's part of the issue, but the other part of the issue is that EPA, as it's going in, is discovering more contamination in areas that they didn't previously know it existed, and they're having to modify the approach because of that.
Okay, and based on Representative Matison's comments on the person that you replaced, I believe there was not as much cooperation with the community in the past, because what I've witnessed is a belief that there was no contamination down to very little, and we've now swung to a much more amount of radioactive waste. So not only is it hotter than they anticipated, but it's greater volumes, and it's left its original site. So my frustration is, had we had a committee like this beforehand, and had we given you a stronger voice, perhaps we could have been in a better situation, or at least been monitoring this before we were finding out in 2024, 2023, that this containment's rolling off site. Let's put that in our conversations, because as I look at these sites that we've been talking about for decades, realize one of these sites, we don't even really have a cleanup plan, and the materials were found along St. Charles Rock Road, I believe. Is that correct?
I'm not sure.
Okay. And so it still troubles me that we have additional sites. So if there's no other questions, I'm gonna thank you guys for coming up and speaking, and I'm gonna have somebody else come up to kind of talk about those other sites very quickly.
Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, I would like to call Alicia and Rodiger. Okay, thank you. And if you haven't filled out a form, okay, you have, thank you very much.
Hi, my name's Alicia Rutger.
Alicia, can you bring that closer to you? You might have to speak a little louder. We have a hard time up here hearing.
How's that?
That's great, thanks.
Thank you. I've been been asked to speak a little bit about the EEOI CPA program. Congress passed EEOI CPA, the Energy Employee Occupational Illness Compensation Program Act.
I do need you to speak louder.
Oh, I'm sorry, in 2000, as a bipartisan effort to compensate workers and their survivors who developed certain illnesses as a result of exposure to radioactive and toxic substances. To date, 241,855 cases have been made, with 356,937 individual claims filed in Missouri today. Combined compensation for Part B and E, which we'll go over in a moment, is $15 billion, $143,793,000, $11 billion paid out, $938,476 in medical bills, for a total compensation and for $27 billion, $82,269,000. Part B is for radiation-induced cancers, chronic beryllium disease, chronic silicosis, and beryllium sensitivity for medical monitoring only. Part E is any condition that can be linked back to chemical exposure. Part B is for a payout of $150,000. Part E is for a maximum of $250,000. So if you're approved, you could receive up to a benefit of $400,000 maximum. That is tax-free. There are 11 sites in Missouri, as you know, Kansas City Plant and Kansas City.
Can you just speak this slower? We're gonna take notes on these 11 sites and just a little bit louder.
Okay. Kansas City Plant in Kansas City, Missouri. Bellatty Avenue Properties in Hazelwood, Missouri. Mallinckrodt, St. Louis Destrehan Street. Meadart in St. Louis, Missouri. Roger Iron Company in Joplin, Missouri. And St. Louis Airport Storage in St. Louis, Missouri. Tyson Valley Powder Farm in St. Louis, Missouri. United Nuclear Corporation in Hematite, Missouri. And Weldon Springs Site, Weldon Spring Quarry, and Weldon Spring Raffinate Pits. There's over 381 sites across the United States. As a worker we only provide home care to the atomic energy workers and those who've done remediation in these sites. I've seen firsthand the devastation that chronic exposure to chemicals and radiation can cause. For example, a gentleman from Hematite, Missouri, or Hillsborough, was recently approved under this program for numerous cancer conditions. He received a NIOSH dose reconstruction, which if at 50% they are approved. His dose reconstruction was over 90% probability of causation, but it had never been seen before by me. And another example of a worker in St. Charles has such severe breathing problems from working at Weldon Springs. It takes him literally 10 minutes to walk the length of his home. He has severe anxiety as well from not being able to breathe properly. He has been paid under Part E, but the medical care is what he was most interested in. So when you're approved for the benefit, you also receive a white card through the Department of Labor, which will cover your medical benefits for the claimed condition, durable medical equipment, pharmacy benefit, home care, and hospitalization, doctor visits, etc. So he was most interested in that. But I wanted to emphasize that if you're approved, these cases receive $400,000 maximum tax-free monetary compensation as well as a medical benefit.
to the committee. She was able to come and speak with her notes, but her employer does not authorize her to ask questions outside of her fact sheets. The reason why I think it's important is it's their organization with the EOICPA, which is the federal funding for atomic workers that were injured, whether they were the workers from the production or the remediation. We always get asked, well, how do you know it caused health issues? And I think that this program shows exactly the health issues. As you can hear, there's 11 sites, and maybe you can just tell me again, how much has Missouri paid out?
Missouri has paid out, 200 billion?
200 million?
200 million, I'm sorry, 200 million.
Okay.
I wanted to tell you also as well that the site exposure matrix on the Department of Labor EEOICPA website lists the chemicals for each site. So that is accessible. You can see when those chemicals were for each site that's listed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have one clarification.
Thank you very much. You are, you're with a government organization?
No, a home care company.
Okay, home care company. But you had said, and I didn't quite get the number, but over 2,000 Missouri Missouri citizens who were employees of the federal government have accessed this or potentially access it, that are ill.
How many claims have been paid out in Missouri?
I have the dollar amount, it's 200 million.
I thought you had mentioned a certain number of federal employees. No? Okay. All right, my misunderstanding. Sorry about that. And you said the maximum benefit is 400,000.
400,000, but it's no cap on the medical benefit.
Oh, okay. So 400,000 is a damages kind of a payment.
Yes.
Like they can't work anymore or whatever, right? Okay. And then make sure I understand you correctly, that this payment isn't coming out of the Missouri Treasury, it's coming out of the U.S. Treasury.
Federal government.
Okay, and so these are citizens of Missouri who have received benefits on the order of 200 million, or, yeah, 200 million, something
They
like
don't
that.
necessarily have to be citizens of the Missouri. They can have worked in several sites.
Okay, so, but if they were from another state, they wouldn't be making application here unless they were living here in Missouri, right?
A lot of these workers worked at multiple sites.
But in Missouri, as far as this
Not
particular.
Not
Okay.
necessarily, no, they could have worked at Rocky Flats in Colorado, Nevada test site. All those.
But they're living here now, under.
Living here now,
Yeah,
yes.
okay, yeah, now that was what I wanted to make sure, was that these are citizens of Missouri, however many that is. Do we know that number? How many total employees are involved in this program right now? They're
Gosh, I
former
have-
employees?
I have
Okay.
no idea.
Do you know where I would find that information?
I believe on the Department of Labor EEOICPA
Okay.
website.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to call up Kenneth Kerpash. If you could state your name.
My name is Kenneth Kirkpash. I live in Troy, Missouri.
Okay. And there's been some information that you were eyewitness to, as far as the cleanup, well, not cleanups, I'm sorry. Can you just speak to what you have witnessed in Missouri related to this program?
I worked at Westlake Pouring Material Company from 77 to 71 till 6/8 of 86. And I was hauled rock out of the quarry up to the crusher. And I found out after I left there drawing of it over here, but they said I can't show everybody. I don't know why, but, I know that for a fact to be there.
I do have copies of the maps, they've been distributed. Do you have your copy as well?
I do.
If you would like to have us, you can walk us through that, if you would like.
Well, it's not real clear on the copy machine, but everywhere I got a zero there.
Hold on one second, I'm sorry, Representative. Okay, if you would like to get your map so that you can use it as a reference for yourself, but we cannot use it as a prop. As long as it's sitting on your table like a document, you can walk us through it and then we'll follow along on the copies that we have. There's just, we're not allowed as a committee to have props in a committee hearing. But you can do it just like that.
Okay, well, everybody that's looking at the map you got, everything that's got a circle with an X in it, that's where most of the stuff that they buried is up in the sanitary landfill up by St. Charles Rock Road and the employee parking lot. And where it says Schumann Paving Company, we had stockpiles up there, and no matter how cold it got, there was never no snow on the ground or nothing. It was so hot there that it burned everything off. And then they got to burying it in the stockpile of the sanitary fill. And then when they built the asphalt plant, they buried a bunch of it in the tunnel down there to get rid of it and the lower garage. And then they started putting it up in the sanitary landfill right behind the construction landfill. And I also worked at Weldon Spring at Hamburg Quarry, which would be, it's right on the river, and that would be northwest of Weldon Spring. And we loaded barges out of there when I worked for Westlake and loaded them to put the rock on the dikes. And when we was working up there, there was 55-gallon barrels, thousands of them in the quarry. They was stacked like 8 and 10 high. They was rotting and everything. And the water was just green as emerald green. And I asked the operator down there, I said, what's going on? He said, they won't hurt you. He said, I went over there and looked, there wasn't a frog or a fish or wasn't even no moss on it. So I'm sure it wasn't Kool-Aid in them drums.
Now, the Hamburg Quarry is not the quarry that is currently remediated.
No, ma'am.
Do you feel confident you're not remembering the quarry that was remediated?
I don't know where that is at Weldon Spring.
It's a couple miles south of the current.
No, this would be, if you go to the Chesterfield Bridge, you can see the opening where the trees are, where we loaded out of. That's where it's at. Approximately a mile and a half upstream on the Missouri River on the right-hand side.
Okay, and you saw barrels of,
Thousands of barrels.
okay. Are you eyewitness to any other areas in Missouri?
Yes, I was. I helped a contractor friend of mine, Bob Hunsel, work over at the Bob Zeichen's landfill over in Wright City. One of the most hazardous landfill in the Midwest.
We don't hear much about this landfill in Wright City.
Yeah, he left the country after he got my buddy for quite a bit of money, and he skipped out. He's got an island somewhere down in the Pacific. He drug up, and I went to Bob Hunsel's funeral last summer.
What material do you think they put in that landfill in Wright City?
It was all in barrels. The holes was 60 by 60, 60 foot deep. They filled them up with barrels and buried them.
have Representative West. I think you know a little bit about this landfill in Wright City. If you have additional questions, I'll refer to you.
And not at this time, thank you.
Okay.
Are there any other, I've heard stories about how you've watched dumpsters buried out at Westlake.
Yeah, they buried a couple tractor trailers on the construction field. I worked a double shift one day and I was stockpiling, I watched them dig it. Then right before dark, they pulled them in there, closed the door, walked out, buried them.
And that's in the current Westlake landfill?
Yes, ma'am. But I heard, that the people out there working for doing the cleanup at Westlake, they're from Pennsylvania and New York. See, they don't hire anybody from around here because they don't want nobody to know what's going on. But I have had a friend of mine fly over it, and he said that they've got quite a project on, and I went to a meeting 3 years ago down in Bridgeton about the Westlake landfill, and they said that this fire that's burning underground, they say when it gets enough air, that there'll be 10 foot of water on the courthouse steps in St. Charles County. They'll take every bridge out on the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers.
I know that I've heard you testify to these different things before. The Zykin is the first time that I've heard about that. So,
Bob Zykin Jr., that was his name.
who do you think he was contracted with to dump those?
I don't have any idea who it was, but I know one thing, the trucks that hauled in there, all they had was an MC number and an ICC number, and there was no name on it. No names.
I have no more questions.
But before I get finished here, I lost my wife 5 years ago, and she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. And I know for a fact, I mean, you never get any, you can't hire a nuclear doctor in St. Louis. They look at you like you fell off a turnip truck. But my wife had come down, she'd come down and pick me up at the quarry and stuff. And I don't think that had anything to do with it, but she washed my clothes, and my clothes, I looked like a snowman, and nobody ever offered us any kind of protective gear, or nobody offered us any kind of clothing or anything. And you know where all my bosses and everything are at? They're dead. There's only about 6 people left, and I'm one of them.
Representative Mann?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick clarification here. I looked it up on the map here. I think I can see the quarry that you're talking about on this map, but it also looks like that tract of land has been subdivided into lots or
For
something.
houses.
There's houses. in-
Yeah, they're building houses on it.
And there's some pretty big businesses adjacent to it. Okay,
That don't shock me none.
thank you very much.
Yeah, don't drink the Kool-Aid out there.
Representative Matisse?
Mr. Kenny, it's good to see you again. I remember our conversation we had about this back in, it's probably been 2017.
You got a better memory than me.
Yes. Can you refresh my memory? What was the years that you worked in the Westlake area?
I started at 7/7 of 71, and I left there 6/8 of 86.
Okay. Do you know, who was the owner of the landfill at that time?
Catholic Church.
So is it your testimony that unknown products were just brought into the landfill driven in there by truck and and at least twice, somebody just got out of their truck and walked out, or at least once?
One time.
One time.
Trucks.
So the entire truck was left in the
They
landfill.
did not hook up.
Everything on the truck was left in the
It was a
landfill.
van trailer, they pulled in there, closed the door, walked out, got in the car and left.
And my guess, based on my knowledge of the site, is there are no records whatsoever on what was in any of these barrels, what was on that truck.
As far
Was the landfill lined with anything to prevent any of that material from leaving the site?
You mean the sanitary landfill?
Yeah, the sanitary.
No, it was not.
Right.
But when they started filling in the deep hole, it was 1,300 foot deep,
Mhm.
where they poured all the rock out of it. They did put a liner every lift on it, and we'd have to cover it up every day from 4 to 6 o'clock with dirt or rock, whatever we had.
Mhm.
The
And
dirt-
that's in the area labeled as Westlake 1, and the area labeled, it's just to the left of that on your drawing there?
Yes.
Okay, very
Yes,
good.
yes. But the dirt, the soil that was hauled from over Laddie Avenue and that,
Mhm.
that's what they covered the dump with up there by the office next to St. Charles Rock Road.
Right. All of that material
B&K Construction hauled it in there.
brought by B&K, combined with soil sold to that landfill as clean fill dirt, was actually contaminated with radiologically impacted material, just spreading that over and over every day to bury unknown, we don't know what.
Pretty much so.
It's a chilling reminder of everything that went on at that
Yeah,
site for
you
so
know,
many years.
Representative Mass, what's really the sad thing though, is nobody ever said anything about how bad everything was, and nobody ever offered us any protective gear or coveralls or anything.
Right.
And there's not many people left, not one of them. And my mother passed away with cancer too, and I'm the kind of guy that don't believe in coincidences, and I know
Right.
that the landfill, my wife washing my clothes, I know that killed my wife.
Okay, thank you so much for being here to recount that for me.
Thank you very much for coming and testifying. We
Okay.
really appreciate you as an eyewitness to some of the stuff you witnessed.
Okay, thank you.
Next, I'd like to call up Kim Byzantine.
Hello, hi there, is it me?
Now, have you filled out your form?
I did.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming, and I'd like everyone to know she did travel from another state to be here. The reason why I think it's important to get your testimony is a group of your friends had some anecdotal evidence, and you went to great lengths to be able to document what you found at Coldwater Creek. With that, I'm gonna let you have the floor and talk about your experience and how you went from anecdotal evidence to scientific proof of harm.
Absolutely. So
And
first-
say your name, full
Yes.
name again.
All right, I'm Kim Byzantine, and I'm one of the founding members of the Coldwater Creek Group, which we started in 2011. I am a former North County resident, grew up in Florissant. My parents were first homeowners in the area. My mom still lives in the area, so 70 years my family has lived in Florissant near Coldwater Creek. I grew up in the area, I was personally affected as well. My son was born with a glioblastoma multiforme, which is called a rare brain tumor. Congenital glioblastoma multiformes are tumors that are at birth. There are only 50 documented cases in U.S. medical journals at this time. Typically, glioblastomas are related to 60-year-old men, so brain tumors found in old men, or radiation victims. So, by trade, I am an engineer. I went to Rolla, born and moved to Detroit, worked in the automotive industry, was a senior director of engineering, global director of engineering for Big Three automotive company. After my son was born, I decided that I wanted to go into the medical field, so I resigned my position in the automotive industry, went back to school, became a nurse. I am a doctorate of nursing and nurse practitioner, and I currently practice in the emergency room as a provider. So just to give you a little bit of my background as, coming into this. So several of my friends and I all grew up in the area. We were neighbors. We all went to Motor North. We went to high school together. We played in the creek. We all moved away. And I always joke with folks that that's a very common thing, right? You grow up in an area, you live with your parents, and hopefully when you're 40 years old, you are not living in their basement. Many of us moved away for jobs after going to school. And so the only way that we reconnected was via social media. And social media was really just kind of taking off in the early 2000s. Facebook came to fruition in 2008, 2009. And so friends of ours, we started reconnecting, and we were dispersed all over the country. Just a little bit about the founding members of the Coldwater Creek Group. Again, all growing up in the area. I myself hold a doctorate in healthcare, and I'm an engineer. My other founding members, there's 6 of us. One is a doctorate in PhD. She has her PhD in economics, teaches at Northwestern, and consults for the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. Another one, he graduated from Yale. He teaches at Princeton. He is also a political science PhD. Another member is a CPA, and she sits on a foundation for an academic university. I won't disclose it this time. Another one teaches economics at SIU Carbondale, and another is a web designer. So we all come from mathematical and academic backgrounds. Maybe that's our radiation exposure, we don't know. However, we all were kids that grew up in North County in the 1970s and 80s. So as we came together, we started realizing that our friend group had all of these significant cancers. And all being engineers and scientists and mathematicians, we started realizing that statistically, this was an improbability. One of the girls in our group, she pulled out a grade school yearbook from Paul's Ferry, and she started marking off people who were sick. And she's like, how is everybody in our grade school sick with cancer? It's improbable. So we started a group. We didn't know about the contamination. We grew up our whole lives. There was no social media growing up, so there was no verbal way for people to kind of understand about contamination. FuseRep was cleaning up the area, but how many times do you walk by a construction site and not realize what they're doing, right? So we started a group. We started asking folks if they were sick, and the response was overwhelming. That was in 2011. So we began in 2012 to formally organize within our group, and we started a health survey using SurveyMonkey. We started asking folks,
Kim, could you move the mic a little closer?
Sorry. So we started asking folks, did you grow up in the area? Do you currently have cancer? Because many of us did not live in the area anymore. The response was overwhelming. We began to map these. If you ever see those cancer maps, we created those. One of our founding members is a defense mapping specialist, or a global defense mapping specialist. So as we began to plot these, we started seeing a lot of patterns, and we started seeing a lot of specific cancers. Those cancers, and again, we're just citizens that live in the area. We were fortunate enough to have our educational backgrounds. We've noticed that there were high rates of brain tumors. We noticed there were high rates of breast cancers, autoimmune diseases, appendix cancer. I'm going to go back to my background in healthcare, and I will say that appendiceal cancer, which is very prominent or very prevalent in the North County area, we have more than 60 cases within a 5-mile radius. But appendiceal cancer, according to most recent medical journals, is 1 in 200,000. There are 300,000 people who live in the North County area, if that gives you any example, right? So we should have 1, maybe 2. We have more than 60. And then we have a subset of appendix cancer, so it's not just run-of-the-mill appendix cancer. It's pseudomyxoma, peritoni, or PMP cancer, which is also called jelly belly. And what it does is it adheres to your abdominal cavity and is always typically terminal within a 3 to 5 year period. So these are the types of things that we were seeing in our population of kids that grew up playing around the creek. We originally approached the CDC and the EPA, and of course, they're like, you're just a bunch of random people approaching us, and there's nothing wrong, nothing to see here, please move along. We did approach the Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services, and they did oblige us in 2013, and they put out a study. That study showed no higher rates of cancer. Well,
Can you repeat that again in 2013?
13, Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services put out a study saying that there's nothing to see here. However, having our academic backgrounds, we went back and poured over all of the study constraints. And I have to give kudos to the Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services, because when we sat down with them as their peers on their level and went over the constraints, we discussed very specific things, okay? When low-level chronic exposure to ionizing radiation takes decades to present as cancer, not years. And so one of the study constraint issues was the study was only 8 years long. So with it taking decades to present from exposure, we needed it to be longer, so they widened the study to be 25 years so that they would get historical illnesses. We also asked them to look at very specific zip codes. They obliged. And when they did, and when they consulted with us as academics, they came back with a revised study in 2014 showing significant increases in cancers in the 8 zip codes that we discussed around Coldwater Creek. And those significant increases in cancers included thyroid, breast, prostate, kidney, colon, bladder cancers, okay? Unfortunately, there is not enough data on appendix cancer to link it to radiation exposure. So while we know it's an anomaly and we have high suspicion, and I use it as an example, there is no historical data on it. So again, as citizens, we came to them facts over feelings, right? Everything that we did was scientific and not emotional, right? All of us have been exposed. I lost my child. He was 6 years old when he died from a brain cancer. Every other founding member has lost an immediate family member from cancer. But despite that, we knew that our emotions would not get the attention needed on the federal level and the data that we needed, so that we approached them very academically. And we were very successful. So what you guys see in front of you, I didn't give you a copy of this, but the analysis of cancer incidents. The Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services actually has a website dedicated to Coldwater Creek and these studies. So it can be found, and I will send Representative Burns the links so that you guys can share. But out of that study in 2014, something great happened. And I did copy you guys on this. There are 3 letters that were written by the Department of Health and Senior Services. And they were written to the Army Corps of Engineers urging additional cleanup. They were written to the General of the Corps of Engineers urging additional funding. And they were also written to the ATSTR, which is the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry, which is a division of the CDC that deals specifically with radiation exposure and toxicological contaminants, urging them to do a public health assessment. Okay. So out of our collaboration with the Department of Health and Senior Services came the opportunity for a study with the ATSTR. Additionally, we also collaborated with the St. Louis County Department of Health. And Dr. Faisal Khan was the director at the time. And Dr. Faisal Khan in 2015 came out with 3 letters. One was written in the Institute of Public Health, warning of the contamination within Coldwater Creek and the suspected illnesses caused from it. He also sent a fax out to all PCPs, or primary health care providers, in the St. Louis County area, telling them of the risk factors of their population and asking him to take a second look or listen to their stories again. And the reason that that's so important is I will tell you that the population that we are seeing these illnesses in is much younger than they should be seen. So the colon cancers, colorectal cancer, most people don't get screened for that until they're 50. We were seeing colorectal cancer in 30 to 35-year-olds. And so what we were appeasing to these primary care physicians is that we were a high-risk population, and we were requesting that they would do additional testing on us if concerns warranted it. Another one is ovarian cancer. Ovarian cancer is a silent cancer that typically doesn't show up until it's in stage 4 or terminal. And typically what will happen is women will present, and I see this all the time in the emergency room as a provider. People will present with abdominal pain, bloating, very vague symptoms. And so typically what happens is they're in their 30s to 40s. They have young children. They come in with fatigue, and so their symptoms are brushed off as you're a young mom, eat better, lose weight, go home, change your diet, right? But we know that we're a high-risk population, so we were appeasing to these federal health agencies to pay attention, because if they could do testing on these women who are at higher risk, we could find these diseases when they were treatable and not terminal, right? And so that is what Faisal Khan's fax did for us. So we continue to work with them. That was in 2015. In 2016, we began to engage with the ATSDR, and we actually consulted with them on the public health assessments. So we met with them via phone conversations, in person, and we provided all the study constraints to them. So our group, if you look at it, you will see that there were this is just a summary of the ATSDR findings. The document is actually 200 pages long. And what we did is, again, low-level chronic exposure to ionizing radiation takes decades to present. But it also means that you have to be in the creek almost daily, right? And so what you're looking at is today's population of children. It's an anomaly for a child to be outside from the time the sun comes up to, 10 o'clock at night. It's just today's generation. When we were growing up in the 60s and 70s, your parents booted you out of the house. Usually it came from large families. I know I'm a good Catholic family, one of 7, so, if they lost one of us, it was no big deal. But they would send us out of the house at 7 in the morning, don't come home until dinner, right? And so we were outside doing up to no good, playing in the creek where we didn't belong. But the ATSDR study mirrors that and states that you would have to have been outside, up to 285 days a year, 6 to 8 hours a day, and you would have to ingest or inhale these substances. And so, we went through all of these constraints with them. So you're probably like, okay, great. So you did all these studies, you started a Facebook page. What good does that do us today? If we want compensation for our communities, I'm going to go back to the saying, facts over feelings. It's great. We can all be sad. We can all be pissed off about this. But at the end of the day, if we don't have the factual data to go up against the government, we're not going to get any results, okay? And that's the engineering economy, and that's the healthcare provider economy. So doing these studies and partnering with these agencies is the path. It's the pathway, okay? We have to be willing to provide the information. I mean, I think, and Representative Burns, you and I have talked about this, and with Jonathan Groot from DHSS, that perhaps, you know, community members within the Weldon Springs area could offer input to the DHSS to do a very similar study of what they did for Coldwater Creek. So with these studies, we can approach these federal agencies and ask for the restitution. And if you look at Hanford, if you look at some of the sites out west, that's how they did it, right? They got the federal government to say, yes, there has been illness and it is associated with your exposure. And honestly, that's what the ATSDR study does for the Coldwater Creek area. It says you were exposed and it is most likely the cause of your illness. So the bat's there, somebody needs to swing it, okay? Things that will come with this restitution with the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. Yes, there's a small amount of money that can be gotten, and that's wonderful. But that's not gonna bring back my 6-year-old. That's not gonna bring back somebody's wife, right? So the big goal, or the big get beyond that, is there is a program through HRSA, HRSA, which is part of the DHSS. And it is called, and I gotta get my acronyms right, guys, sorry, I'll look up. It is called the Radiation Exposure Screening and Education Program, RESEP, okay? Being included in RECA, or the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, allows us access to this program. And what this program does is allows any entity within these areas of exposure that the government deems one of these zip codes to apply for a $300,000 grant annually that can be used for education and health screening. Okay, that's the goal. That's the goal for today's folks, for the people living in North County, right? If we set up these screening programs that people can go every year and get screened, maybe you're not burying your 6-year-old, right? Maybe it's treatment, right? Do we want treatment? No. Do we want to be exposed? Absolutely not. But we can't go back and change what happened to us 20 years ago. Okay? Of course, cleaning up, they're doing a hell of a job. Today is better than it was in the 90s. But at the end of the day, we have to help the folks that have been exposed. And the way to do that is to keep them from getting a terminal diagnosis. So I hope sharing my pathway kind of helps.
It does. And I want to ask, because you are data-driven, some of our folks, they are running out of time, right? They're leaving kids in high school and in college, and they're dying. In your area, which is where I grew up, so it's still my area, but out in Francis Hall as well. And I feel like that time for the government to step up has kind of passed. Like, they shouldn't wait for us to all be dead before they say, you know, maybe the nuclear bomb kills people.
Right.
So if we were gonna look at data to be a little more expedient, it seems to me we could use your studies, and thank you for doing the work. We also had somebody testify about how many claims have been paid out by people who worked in Missouri. That if we live if we went to school, swam in quarries, and were near these other sites additionally, like these ones, they have medical information, they have dosage reconstructions. I think, and I'm not a data person, but I think it's a good argument to say, how many studies do we need if we have residents who were in a creek and we have employees during cleanup who were blowing up buildings next to a high school, that we are presenting documents. Additionally, all of these cleanup areas where there is cleanup, they had to convince a federal agency that there was enough harm to the community and the environment. So I feel as if we do have a pretty good argument. We have the studies that you have, we have the studies from the workers' federal program, and then we have the studies that they did in order to cause cleanups, like at Weldon and Coldwater Creek, and unfortunately, we're still working on that at Bridgeton. But I do feel like we have good documentation at this point. Do you feel like there is documentation to prove?
With what you stated, yes, I do. I think that in combination combination with that, the EIOCP data, the public health assessment data, the DHSS data from 2014, not 13, so the revised study, I think there is enough, and then if you can take that and extrapolate it out, so. But I do believe that if we are going for an ask, you know, I'm sure you guys know, on a financial committee, nobody gives money on emotion, you need to give money on the data, but yes, I do think it's there.
Okay, and then I want to open it up for questions. Representative Harvey?
Hi there, and thank you for coming, thank you for your work. I appreciate as a person who loves a good empirical study, I'm going to echo the chairwoman. I'm not sure how many more studies we can do. I'm not in a position where I think citizens should have to beg and plead the government to do right by its investment that we pay through our labor and tax dollars. That's not my approach to this. It won't be my approach to this so long as the good Lord allows me to be a voice for the people who don't have time for that.
Well, fortunately for Coldwater Creek, it's done already.
Sure. I'll just say I trust the government, the same government that experimented on black folks the same time that they were experimenting in Pruitt-Igoe over that same course of time and denied doing it. As I trust them as much as I should have trusted them then. I don't care what the federal government is saying, and not with all due respect. I encourage everyone sitting in the audience, even though I'm an elected person, to look at the government with skepticism, because it was our own government that did this to us. I don't trust them to be honest. They're telling people in Pruitt-Igoe that a known carcinogenic did not cause them any harm. That's absurd. Is that the government we trust the same people who injected folks with syphilis for 40 years and gave them medical treatment, so they're doing a good job? No, ma'am, absolutely not. I'm happy to read your study. I think that the data that you presented will certainly supplement the acts. My First Amendment right, as well as yours, give you a right to petition your government for redress of grievance. They can be like facts, not feel, and see how they feel when you don't elect them the next time. Accountability is for everyone, even those of us who do research. Research isn't to necessarily dispel and let folks off the hook. Sometimes it's to show that a harm has been done, and if that's not the purpose of the research, I'm not interested in the research. What we do know is that the federal government use citizens, and in areas where citizens live, to do things like test things that we know are toxic, point blank, period. They are toxic, they cause harm for human beings. What the government and governments are very good at is defending themselves. So pardon me if I feel dismissive or coming off as dismissive. I don't trust the government. I understand why the other people who grew up and live in this area don't trust the government. I'll be honest with you, I don't trust people who work too closely with the government, and it gives the appearance that they're trying to get the government off the hook as if they're doing a good job. I played in the dirt in Latin. I ate that dirt as a child. I ate that dirt. I have lupus. My cousin has had a kidney transplant. I don't know if I can have children. So all of these, what other studies do they need? Do they need my medical records? That's a study over the course of time. I'm getting leery at the suggestion that we need to do more besides die. That's all we have left around her. So again, I certainly thank any academic as an academic that has written 2 dissertation proposals. A dissertation and has done that work, whose work and dissertation is anchored in case studies. I certainly appreciate the work that has been done, but I would urge a public to stay skeptical and continue to question your government, continue to question their motives, particularly when it comes to you getting a return on your best investment that you made by merit of your work when they took taxes out of your pocket. Thank you.
I just wanted to say the statement again that I believe we already have enough proof. I believe you have proof. I believe these programs have proof. And I do not believe we need to wait to die to be made whole. Who else do we? Representative Mayhew.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, let me just say thank you for everything that you've done, and I am so sorry for your loss. no mother should have to go through that. As it turns out, I'm one of 10 kids, so I feel your pain, right? Except in my case, 7 of those were sisters, so now you can really feel sorry for me. I'm an engineer by trade, and as you and I both know,
I
that
think you
we're,
and I were at Rolla together.
so it's been a day or two, right? And we're trying to try to do our best to take emotion out of our decision-making process. We're data-driven. We rely on the numbers. However, I can get a little emotional, as some of my colleagues can attest, when I'm faced with bureaucratic BS. And I'm sorry that you had to go through that, but as much as we want to try to look toward the future, we would be doing any decision a disservice if we didn't look at the mistakes that were made in the past. And specifically from the state standpoint, I appreciate and I love the fact that we have addressed the concerns that you had, but I kind of need to know why it took so long, right? So, you know, your statement about that the first study didn't cover the right segment of the population, didn't consider these things. I hope, and I'll be talking to the health department in the future about what we can do to make sure that something like this doesn't fall through the cracks. You were talking about the incidence of these diseases being in the 60 category per 300,000 people, and normally you would see 1 or 2 in that size of population. I don't know if we have a notification mechanism. Is there a reporting thing? And you don't need to answer that question. But if there isn't something that would identify that, then perhaps we need a way to recognize that there's an issue in a particular segment of our population related to those kind of concerns. I mean, we do it right now with communicable diseases, right? You know, when the flu breaks out in a certain area, there's all of a sudden we'll say, oh, okay, hey, we got to run there and do something about that, right? So I'm a little bit concerned that it wasn't until you presented as I'm a healthcare professional, and you know, here's my data on this thing before we decided that we would do another study, and then the results of that letter was, or that new study was a strongly worded letter to the federal government. I hope that in the future, whenever we're faced with these kind of issues, that this is something that is moved up the chain, and perhaps it was in this case, and perhaps I wasn't aware of it, and if I wasn't, then maybe that it's on me. But, or when I say me, I'm talking about the legislature. For us to take action beyond a strongly worded letter, because we're talking about citizens of the state of Missouri, right, with ongoing health problems related to a federal program that was housed here in Missouri. And I'm just like you. I was one of those kids that was, Mom booted us out the door, and you know, the first place I went to was the creek.
Yeah, same here.
Right? That was our toys, right? And so I relate to that experience 100%. That is what we do. If you had a request of what we could do to avoid this being protracted out, something like this being protracted out so long, would you have a suggestion on what we could do?
Yeah, so, and perhaps DHSS can answer this a little bit, because I'm not an epidemiologist, but it's my understanding through the years that we did this, that epidemiology looks at cancer clusters in a very specific way. They take current census data, okay, current. They take disease registry data, and they take death certificates, okay? And this is is the way they've been doing it for years. And let me tell you why those 3 items are very flawed in today's society. 50 years ago, you moved down the street and you lived away right on the same street as mom and dad, right? Today, dispersed all over. I work for Chrysler. Chrysler moved me to Detroit, right? So it's easy to just be picked up and moved across the country now. So we're a much more transient society. So current census data in an area does not capture an exposed population. You don't have to move to Detroit. You can move to Fenton, right? Or you can move to Rolla, or you can move to Kansas City. The fact is if you move out of the specific area, you're no longer captured in that census data. Number 2, disease registry. When you are diagnosed with cancer, it only captures where you live, and this is on a national level. But cancer registries are kept on a state level, not a national level. But across the states, the way the cancer registries capture data is they capture where you live at time of diagnosis, okay? I married my husband, we were newlyweds, my son was born, we lived on the hill. My husband grew up on the hill as a child. So I didn't live in the Coldwater Creek area at that time, right? So already I was out of the area when he was diagnosed with a glioblastoma multiforme. But if you were exposed as a child, again, chronic low-level exposure to ionizing radiation takes decades to present as cancers. Think about going through an x-ray machine every day, right? I could tell you to walk through the airport every day, back and forth, back and forth. You're not gonna show up with cancer. You might show up with, your risk is gonna increase, but you might not show up with cancer for 20 years, right? Same thing with this exposure to our waste, because it's low level. So by the time folks are diagnosed with cancers, they no longer live in the area. So again, not captured for the cancer clusters, right? And then the third data is death certificates. Death certificates only capture final cause of death. And while this is very morbid as a healthcare provider, I share my experience with my son because it's very important, right? The glioblastoma multiforme, it was on his pituitary gland or his brain stem. So all of your basic functions of life. So when he finally succumbed to his disease after we fought and did chemo and multiple neurosurgeries for 6 years of his life, when he finally succumbed to his disease, it was respiratory failure. So his death certificate does not capture cancer, it captures respiratory failure. So strike 3. Strike 1, didn't live in Florissant when he was born. Strike 2, his disease registry wasn't captured to the census data. And then 3, respiratory failure, not cancer for his diagnosis. But 6-year-olds don't die from respiratory failure without some other cause, right? So that's what. So if I had a ask, like a Christmas wish list, it would be, I guess the first thing would be to have cancer registry data capture historical data, because I don't think you can truly, but that's a federal thing, right? But you can't truly begin to denote cancer clusters if you can't look at historical data.
Yeah, understanding that, I mean, the challenges are huge, like you said, and thank you for pointing that out, that, you know, that population can disperse fairly quickly and lose that resolution on the data, fairly easily. However, once again, my primary concern is that once we learn that, but it's easy to make a mistake, right? Especially on something as complicated as this, and you had taken the time to connect all those dots that we wouldn't necessarily be able to do, in a particular state department, no matter what it is. However, the next step is where I think we failed as a state, or perhaps we can improve. And that is where we actually do get action. And it's kind of like what we've already talked about here, is that it's got to move beyond bureaucrats exchanging pieces of paper and emails and things like that. We have to go to something physical, something actual, something actionable in order to affect the result that we all want, right? There ain't a single person in this room or in the state of Missouri that isn't interested in trying to fix this problem from the DNR folks who want to make sure that the site is being properly remediated, to the health department folks who want to make sure that we address those health concerns, but also from a future standpoint, to make sure we don't fall into this trap again, right? And I think that's what the legislature can hopefully address, is to whatever controls or processes that we can put in place if it requires legislation. You had pointed out that we have this disparate data spread all over the United States, and we don't want to be, nobody wants every movement that they make, monitored by some agency somewhere, but whenever I think that, so just something that popped in my head, you tell me if this would be a thing to do, is that you were talking about these registries where these particular types of cancers go in. Whenever there is these rare things, wouldn't it be prudent to put a spotlight on that and do some, for lack of a better term, contact tracing to, if it's this rare, I mean, understandably, if you end up with 8 of these in the entire country and then you do contact tracing, just as an instance, and you find out they all come from the same town.
Yeah.
Would there be any benefit in your mind, after doing all your research, to requiring a higher level investigation whenever those kind of rare things pop up? Is there even a way to do that from your research?
I'm a provider in the ER. I'm not an academic in the medical field, so I don't know on the research side of that, but it makes sense to me. I know some of the academics, I know the caveat to that is, and this is just unfortunate, when you start to contact trace and do stuff like that, insurance and how people are affected long term. We were actually warned about that because there's a brain tumor. Actually, when your child expires in the St. Louis Children's Hospital, there is they will take a sample of the brain tumor. And we were cautioned at one time by a neurosurgeon who's no longer in the St. Louis County area to be very careful with that because it can affect future insurance issues for others. Unfortunately, that is an unfortunate, crappy thing, but it is something to be very cautious when you go because you don't want to offend for other people, and that's a bureaucracy. But in a perfect world, yes, I think contact tracing would be a very good thing.
And I don't like that word, but because it really doesn't apply.
Right.
But do you understand?
Yeah, I understand, but contact tracing, whatever you're saying, but some way to check these, like this appendix cancer is a pretty significant thing. I'd love to see that study.
So we'll talk some more with our departments to see if they have any suggestions. And thank you very much for your testimony, and really appreciate you going to this trouble to do this. You didn't have to, but thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much for coming today. And we're gonna stand at ease for 5 minutes. After we come back, we were given an extra hour. I'm gonna ask DHSS to come forward, because that's gonna be more informational testimony. And then after that, I wanna open it up to anyone here that wants to speak for 3 to 5 minutes about their particular situation that they came here to talk about.
I know. How's everybody? Oh, that's good. That's the important part. Hi, good to see you. Oh. I was loving you. Sorry. So sorry.
if we did have some people that had to leave because we were lucky enough to be granted another hour, I think this has been extremely helpful, and I thank everyone for hanging in here with us. If by any chance we end up going past 3, I will stay in the parking lot. I will do whatever it takes to make sure that I listen to everyone that's here. Or I did not say that publicly. And if you folks could introduce yourself and who you're with.
Thank you. My name is Ben Terrell. I'm the legislative liaison for the Department of Health and Human Services. I am not as smart as TJ, so I brought the team with me, and I'll let them introduce themselves.
My name is Dr. Heidi Miller. I serve as the Chief Medical Officer for the Department of Health and Senior Services.
Jeff Wenzel, Chief of the Bureau of Environmental Epidemiology.
Really quickly, I did just want to say, earlier we talked about a HRSA program under DHSS. That is actually the Department of Health and Human Services.
Can you give us that again?
HRSA, HRSA. That's a federal agency, and someone had said DHSS, so I just want to make sure we got that clarified.
Thank you.
And we are here, happy to take any questions that y'all have.
Okay, so I'll get started with it. Ultimately, we're here to see how we can improve communications and support you, because we believe that there's harm to communities, and we need your support, we need your voice, and we need your information. So that is the goal, and I hope to have work sessions with your group to see if there's any opportunity, whether it's legislative or it's, just coming together with what we can do next for steps. So one of the things that we've seen in this community, the Army Corps was here, and it's a really good example. And I will tell you, as a harmed resident that has never, not always been a politician, how it feels when you have a child harmed and you have a federal agency in front of you. When I see a federal agency in front of me at one of these meetings, back in the day, I viewed them as, well, the federal government's here, and they're here to answer my questions. As I watch these meetings, I really watch people struggle to say, okay, if you're saying low-level waste, what does that mean for me? Or worse, what does that mean for my child or my grandchildren, because I'm finding out it's generational? And the response is typically, well, I can't answer that. I've seen people understand that if you ask the Army Corps, and they're the ones who are construction cleanup, some will understand they can't answer that because it's not within their scope. They're not the health physicists, they're not the expert in health. But others see it as the federal government came here and they don't want to tell me how this is going to impact my child. So I asked how we can support that, and they said that there's been meetings that have involved our other agencies to kind of step in and aid in that. But I just want to tell you, I have also witnessed this, and I've witnessed it at the federal level and at the state level, and at times it's when I'm talking to the wrong people. But let's just say that the EPA, Representative West and I were on a conversation, and we kept wanting to ask, what's going to happen to somebody if their wells aren't tested? What's going to happen to them and their children? We'd ask, well, what filter? And what I have seen in the last 7 years that I've been an advocate and switched obviously to being an elected official, it's almost like people are afraid to be held accountable for their answer, to the point that you leave people in, not you, but the government, whether it's state or federal, they leave people in fear. My other thing that I have witnessed numerous times is talking to people that are part of BJC, SSM, Mercy, Siteman, and they'll come to me and they'll have those secret little conversations of, oh my gosh, this is what someone should do. Or I used to work there and I couldn't believe the kids that had cancer in St. Peter's. And I'd say, well, can you come talk in a public? No, because I'm still employed by one of the hospitals, and if I do that, I'll lose my job. And there's all of this fear, and it's just not fair to our constituents across the state. They don't have somebody who, they're not asking to be reassured, and they're not asking to be made fearful. They're just asking for real, honest questions of what can I do and what should I look for? And I have witnessed them not getting those answers. So one of the things in brainstorming is, and I'll throw this at you guys, if these large systems are gonna be taking care of cancer patients, and they take state dollars, at some point, if you're gonna take state dollars, I need you to come to a meeting, and if we find out people have radioactive waste in their backyard, or they swam in a quarry and they just found out about it, you need to tell them what they can do and what that means for overall health. I am so tired of people walking out frustrated and in tears because nobody can tell them how to protect their kid, what they should look for in their kid, and I'm going on a little bit of a soapbox, but I'm telling you, I've witnessed it over and over, and the secrecy comes out, and it makes people fearful. So you guys are here to answer that one big statement in any way you want to talk about it, and then I'll just ask questions from there.
Okay, we'll see how I do. So generally speaking, Department of Health Senior Services obviously is the public health authority for the state of Missouri. So oftentimes we find that we have the expertise in human health impacts and whatnot. That's one of the reasons that we brought Dr. Miller with us today, so that if posed the question, what are the health impacts you'd expect with nuclear radiation exposure, we have a doctor who can talk about that. So if you want to ask that question, we're ready. There are, I know that government agencies like to stick with their subject matter expertise, and I know we work pretty closely with Department of Natural Resources when there is a meeting and questions. You know, we are careful to stick to what we know, and I know that they do the same, and I think that can be good for providing quality information so that we know what we're saying is correct, as long as we're cooperating so that if the question arises, it is being given to the right person to then answer it, not just let it go in silence. So I know that when these meetings pop up, we do our best to be there to be able to answer those health impacts. And I know that there are times where relevant agencies will defer to us, and you know, we will advise as best we can. One of the things we are always careful to do is make sure to recommend people that they talk to their primary care physician. Talk to your doctor, because your doctor is going to know what your history is, what your records are. You're going to be able to talk to them a lot longer about more specific circumstances than we'll be able to, and then you'll be able to talk with us about.
I really heard your questions. What do we know? What can we do? What do we not know? Let me just share a few things. So we do know the health hazards of radiation exposure. We also know that the dose response curve is linear. There is no safe amount. The more exposure there is, either acutely or over many years, the higher the risk. There are 5 main health effects of radiation exposure. The first is direct cellular damage. That can occur after a bomb. It's usually an extremely large blast of radiation immediately. It can affect your kidneys, your blood vessels, your skin, your hair. You need a very, very high abrupt dose for that. We're probably not seeing that with the current exposures in Missouri. Number 2 is that radiation affects the DNA molecule, which causes mutations, which can increase the risk for cancer, as well as it can affect the immune system and can lead to autoimmune disorders. The third is the extremely severe traumatic distress and psychological effects, which include anxiety, depression, and PTSD. That's on an individual level, not to mention a community's collective trauma. That's number 4. And then number 5 is the severe economic burden and other social and structural determinants of health that impact health. I like to teach medical students that 80% of what influences a person's health, a population's health, has to do with social and structural determinants of health, including this very issue today. So those are the dangers of radiation. Now, let me tell you about the field of medical research on radiation. There has been research on the effect of nuclear bombs, on the effect of having a nuclear power plant explode, on the effect of medical-related radiation, both diagnostic through like CT scans and x-rays, and also therapeutic for people who receive radiation as part of their cancer treatment. And then we've also done some research on occupational exposure. There is a atrocious paucity of research on daily residential exposure. We can try to extrapolate from the other research to understand the impacts. And there are different isotopes, there are different exposures over different time periods, but we can conclude or assume that any radiation is bad, more radiation is worse. Unfortunately, when you get all the way to the cancer center and the cancer has been diagnosed, with our current medical science and the state of our understanding, we cannot tell the difference between a radiation-induced cancer and a cancer caused from other causes. We need to study that and be able to figure that out, but our science is limited right now. Let me pause there to see if you have other questions. Representative West?
Yeah, so this is probably more of a statement than a question, but I see here you're guiding people to talk to their physicians, right? Well, let me tell you a story. My mom ended up with multiple myeloma. We've never had cancer in our family. We eventually ended up down at Saipan because that was the best treatment. And we're looking for answers as to what the heck is going on. And you talk to the doctor about where you live and the concerns you have with the area, which is in Bowling Spring, and he dips his head and he won't talk anymore about it. Now, how is that good advice to talk to your doctor about when they don't want to talk to you back about it?
That's right. Here, here.
I hear you, and I understand that. And I have personally read and researched this topic extensively, but it is not a common part of medical education. In 7 years of medical school and 3 years of residency in internal medicine, maybe in my curriculum, I learned about this for 30 minutes. I've done a tremendous amount of research and reading since then. So I know that doctors who don't know enough and haven't read enough are not going to talk enough to their patients. We need to educate our providers. And one of the reasons why Director Nicholson created my position last year was that public health in Missouri needs a partnership with our healthcare providers. And I promise you that as I go around the state and I speak to the pediatricians and the internists and the OB-GYNs and the family medicine doctors, I will mention this very topic to raise awareness. The St. Louis County Health Department did try to disseminate an educational document that was referenced earlier to educate primary care doctors and oncologists about the risks. I think that's worthy, but doctors, just like everyone else, needs to hear something 7 or 8 times in order to learn it. We need to disseminate that information. However, there is an opportunity, and it's not enough, but it's still something that we can do, which is the bread and butter of primary care and basic health care, which is cancer screening. And right now in the state of Missouri, including in North County and in the St. Louis region, there is basic recommended cancer screening that is being done to low percentage amounts. Breast cancer screening, colon cancer screening, lung cancer screening, cervical cancer screening, and prostate cancer screening. The rates of adherence with those recommendations in our region, depending on the cancer, range anywhere from 10 to 20% to 80%. So at minimum, we should be talking to our doctors about making sure that our screening is all up to date. Of all the cancers that I mentioned, prostate cancer screening, the national guidelines are to have a conversation with your doctor about whether or not to get a PSA blood test. It's not like a straightforward recommendation that every man at age 45 gets the blood test. It's a conversation. So this is exactly the kind of information that needs to be in that conversation, that providers need to be educated that if you grew up in these 11 locations where there was radioactive exposure, that, should I get the PSA? Should I not get the PSA? This would be a reason to. The other thing is that we just need more primary care access and primary care providers providers who have enough time to have these meaningful conversations.
I'm gonna jump in there. So I brought it up just so you can hear this. My son at 15 was diagnosed with thymoma, and it was, I'm sure you know that it's extremely rare. At the time when we found out, I couldn't even Google it. I found a Facebook group and I could not find another child. I had people reach out from Dubai to study his medical records because they thought he might be the only case in the world at that time that just got recently diagnosed. That's how rare this is. I then went to his pediatrician, and I did love the guy. And my other son was kind of scared, and he said, well, if my brother was the only one in the world that has this, can you check me? And I said, he has a fear. I think maybe we should do an x-ray on him, because if it wasn't for an accidental x-ray that discovered it, my 15-year-old wouldn't have graduated high school. And I thought we had a good, compelling argument. And my WashU-educated pediatrician said, do you guys need psychological therapy for what you're going through? And I was like, wow. Now that was, 2015, 2016. A couple of years later, he said, I'm really sorry. Because that's when, in this very room on that half of it, I thought, will anyone ever believe me? They put a bomb plant next to my high school. And I swam in a nuclear waste dump for the federal government. And here we are, so there's that. Eventually he apologized and said, hey, people are starting to talk about it. I was diagnosed with RA in my late 20s. It's coming back after a remission with my child. When I talked to my new rheumatologist, my old one thought I was crazy. I said, everybody I know has an autoimmune disease. It's because I grew up in every site, and if I miss St. Louis, but my grandma and my mother didn't. And they, again, I think it's just in your head. Richard has said, it wasn't that long ago that his mother died. My new rheumatologist, she did say it very much could have contributed to it. But they're afraid to have the conversation. But we've made a big leap from do you need a therapist to maybe it's related. But I do get people who live outside the area now, and they try to say, hey, I went to high school, like I have bladder cancer, I have people with bladder cancer in their 20s. And then as they go back, I say, hey, tell your providers that you went to school and you swam in this quarry. And they are treated like they're crazy. I think at some point we need a letter that says, hey, Missouri had these areas. Could you please provide a letter that says this patient is not crazy? I got so embarrassed to tell them, I started so many sentences, and the people in the room did too. This is gonna sound crazy. And you hate trying to say that over and over again. So you could at least ease that burden. The other thing I want you guys to look at, if you grew up in any of these 11 areas that I don't even know much about, some of these people are gonna be on Medicaid, they're gonna be on Medicare, they're gonna have insurance, maybe they don't have insurance at all. I've witnessed so many people have colon cancers and breast cancers way before they should have ever done their screenings. We need some kind of support that says if you swam in Coldwater Creek, if you walked along the road at Westlake, maybe you should have a colon screening at 40 and not 50. And if we can get insurance to pay for that at 40, not 50, we can make a really big difference in people's lives and ultimately be helpful to the insurance companies if they're aware of this population. I think having those letters and having the ability for the primary care to have a conversation 10 years earlier for some of these testings might really bump up that education within the primary care community. Thank you for listening to that. Can you speak to, that was a lot.
No, I hear you loud and clear. When I was in medical school, they taught us to take a full history and physical. That included a social history. And it was ingrained into us to ask about tobacco and drugs and alcohol, TV exposures, and it was only in around 2000 that we were taught to screen for violence, specifically intimate partner violence. Maybe some occupational exposures. But I think that we can communicate with our current providers, as well as our 7 medical schools, as well as additional schools that train nurse practitioners and PAs, that in our state, we need to be teaching the future healthcare workforce to screen for these issues. Now, I will say that raising awareness will absolutely help. Those providers need guidelines on what to do with that information, and it's confusing. First of all, thank you for sharing your personal stories. I am alarmed as you are. I had a patient with appendiceal cancer and rheumatoid arthritis, and I had never in 25 years seen a case of appendiceal cancer. I understand that there are rare, awful things happening. We need to raise our awareness for that. And we need to study it in order to figure out what to do about it. At minimum, we should be doing these screenings. But and also when people are having symptoms, we need a primary care workforce where they can immediately access help and have that evaluated. Your recommendation for that education and a letter is really, really interesting. In addition, I do know that one thing that is currently underutilized for the general population is genetic testing. And we're not talking about genetic predispositions to cancer here. That is not the purpose of today. However, there are so many undiagnosed genetic predispositions to cancer that anybody who has a family history of cancer, whether it's from living in these areas or elsewhere, they also need to communicate with their provider a request, can I please have genetic testing? Because in some of these neighborhoods where we've seen some extremely sad outcomes, there is probably a reason why in one house there were 4 family members who had cancer, and in the other house there was nobody who had cancer. And there may be a genetic predisposition which added to environmental stressors that then led to the threshold for cancer developing. Oh, and one other thing. It's really tricky to figure out as a clinician what to do for screening, because all screening has side effects. A chest CT is about 6 millisieverts, and the EPA recommends that you don't get more than 1 millisievert of radiation exposure per year. On average, Americans probably get 3 millisieverts. And so, yeah, we want to check, but there are risks to x-rays and to CT scans and to even colonoscopies, which requires anesthesia. And so we really need scientists and epidemiologists and academic physicians to let us know when is the benefit of screening greater than the risk of screening. We have to be really thoughtful about that.
Perfect. I have another question. So as you talk about there's no good level of exposure, could you explain to me why you think one of the biggest places for a field trip in St. Charles County is walking on top of one of the most dangerous sites that ever existed in the world? Maybe you don't know that, but we have at Weldon Spring, they put everything together lined with mud because our soil is supposed to be pretty, not porous, I guess. Pile it all up on a pile of rocks, and we take kids without any exterior signage to walk on top of mixed nuclear waste with TNT, DNT, everything else, so they can see the arch from the pile. I was also stunned that the Department of Energy built an outdoor classroom at the base of it. It's clean to industrial use, and I had a meeting out there, and some bikers, probably having no idea what the pile ever is because there's nothing out there that says something about wildflowers. As we were sitting there was a spigot like you would see if you were getting a bucket to like clean off tables, right? These bikers pulled up, drank right from it, right at the base of a leaching site that's going off-site, yet people are drinking out of it, they're biking in it, and kids are going to the top. And when I say, does it make sense to take a 6-year-old to the top of it? They say, oh, it's safe. I think I'd like your response. What is the positive benefit of standing on top of a mixed pile of waste versus what you said when any radiation's bad?
I can't speak to that. I don't know how to medically justify that. I also don't know the level of millisieverts at the base, at the top. I think we should do what we can to protect our children. Go.
Oh, we have questions.
Yeah, we can't
If you're still gonna, okay, so this is one of those examples of we can't speak to that. But it is the #1 field trip place. Let's have that question be answered in a work session of, do we want to tell, because my kids went to the top of that. And I thought they were going somewhere to see solar panels and wildflowers, and it wasn't until my kid had cancer I found out what that place was. Okay, so you don't understand that. I'd like to, let's add that to our work session, do some more studies on that. Representative Reuter?
Yes, I just have a quick question. I hear what you're all saying. Knowing what you've heard today, would you take your child to go visit this place?
We live in a radioactive world. We receive about 620 milligrams a year. So every time we're outside, we're exposed to some sun. So I would want to know what those levels are and if that's above natural radioactive levels. So I would need to confer just to get that.
So it's kind of a simple question. It's a yes or no question. If your kid wanted to go see this, would you take them?
I would, yes.
Okay. Can I ask the other folks that are from the same department?
You're asking me as a mom.
Yes, I am.
Not as a chief medical officer. St. Louis is an amazing region. I would want to take my child to other exciting places that would have less risk. Yes, we should acknowledge that there is some baseline radiation no matter where you go. If I have my kid out at the zoo all day in the sun, there are dangers associated with that. There are other environmental exposures and letting my kid, I had 2 boys, they only wanted to play in the mud. I had to watch out for lead as well. Yeah, I would be seeking a way to exhaust them, tire them out, have them have a stimulating experience, but I would pick destinations that were of less risk, absolutely.
Okay, and now number 3. We've got it 1 and 1.
Representative Matthiessen.
Hey, I'm gonna redirect the conversation just a little bit. Something on my list that I had coming into it was echoed by a person testifying prior. The data collected from Missouri hospitals regarding certain illnesses and cancers. Tell me about the existing programs in place for you to collect the data from the state, from the healthcare providers.
Unfortunately, our best experts are not here. I'll do my best, but it might be something we want to talk about a little bit more.
Louder.
But we have our emergency room data that's brought into us. That's essence, that's the symptomatics that people present as they come in. We also have reportable conditions that are required to be reported to us. We have things like the cancer registry, so we have a lot of things in place to provide data to us from these hospitals.
So why don't we focus on the cancer registry then? What information is provided to your agency right now from the hospitals regarding new diagnoses of cancer?
We have expertise within our department specifically for the Missouri Cancer Registry, and we are very happy to bring them to a future work group. Currently, our Missouri Cancer Registry is one of the best in the nation. It has received awards for collecting data. We contract out with Mizzou to do that currently, and they measure things like the stage of diagnosis, the type of cancer, the prevalence of cancer for many, many different types of cancers, including the location. They have additional demographic data that they collect, including age and race, and likely more that we can speak to when our colleagues join us next time, if you'd like.
Is there anything in place already that tracks where people have grown up, or is it just focused on where they live right now?
Yeah, their location of residency at time of diagnosis.
Okay. In taking that in mind, how many occurrences of any particular type of cancer or similar cancers need to occur within a small geographic area for the red flags to start going off within your department?
We'd have to talk to the cancer registry about that.
Okay.
Processes.
Absolutely, look forward to that conversation, because I really think, just getting down, and I don't know if that registry is based on statute or, internal, regulation, but I do think we need to focus on that as an avenue for regulation versus statute, and what we can do in the future to expand that, to grow, so that we are focusing on the correct historical data to paint the bigger picture and to help that out.
Right. I think that we will have to bring some more of our experts on that, because when you start looking at the cancer registry, every community has peaks and valleys. For every cancer you're doing well in, you have cancers you're doing poorly in. And we would have flags all over the place. So I think that's why it's difficult to say this is what triggers it, where we do a deeper investigation, because it is not a simple, you've got an increase here, therefore we're gonna, we need to take a look at it. And in addition to that, it is compared to the baseline of Missouri, not necessarily your specific community. So there are certain complexities there that we'd have to bring some subject matter expertise in on.
Absolutely. Is there any cooperation on a state-to-state level to know what's going on in our neighboring states as well?
We work with CDC's Environmental Public Health Tracking Program that's getting a number of states gathering data similarly on environmental and health data. We also have communications with our cancer registry. So yes, there is quite a bit of data sharing between the states and conversations.
Very good. On the county level, I know St. Louis County has done some of their research. I'm sure St. Charles County has some information. How closely do you work with the individual county health departments to track any current issues that may be going on under our nose?
Was the question regarding contacting well, let me back up and see if I can.
Let's go local to state. I mean, how much communication do you have to ensure that any possible trends that may have gone on or could go on in the future, like just how closely do you interact with the counties or the more local jurisdictions to get that data?
In Missouri, we have a decentralized local public health agency infrastructure. Missouri has 115 independent local public health agencies, and so we do our best to interact with them. It is a much larger task than other states that have a centralized or regionalized local public health structure. Our LPHAs, our local public health agencies, we interact with them directly. We have a staff that we work with them. We do pass through funding through them, and each of them are subject to the legally required reportable conditions. So all that data reliably comes into our department for analysis.
And I also think it depends on the question of what you're talking, because for cancer specifically, we have the cancer registry that's housed with us. So that data flows to us, where we are able to analyze it without having to go to the local public health agencies to collect it. But there are other circumstances for other diseases and other instances where we work more closely with them, just as an example, to make sure I'm communicating appropriately. Like for our food inspections and whatnot, a lot of our local public health agencies do that for all that stuff. So that would be a much closer relationship for that specific circumstance.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I look forward to kind of furthering this so that we can ensure whether we need statute the statutory authority, or what we can do to help you out with that.
Representative West.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm going to put you on the spot here. To the best of your knowledge, I know the cancer team isn't here, which is surprising. I would have thought they would have been because it's kind of what we're talking about a little bit. But do you believe, as this time, we have areas of concern in this state where certain cancers are high? Generically, I don't need areas, I don't want, I'm not looking for that, but are there concerns with your office in this state where there are high areas of concern of cancer? Different types, whatever, doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think Ben mentioned it earlier, is you could go into various different locations and find statistically high levels of cancer, but you may also find significant, though, really dependent.
So can you explain to me what your office has done to address these and the citizens of that area, and how you've guided those people and or the physicians in that area, the doctors, the physicians, the healthcare workers, the health department, maybe to proceed with tracking better and or getting you more information, trying to find out reasons why, or just knowledge to the public on get out and get tested if you live in this area?
Sorry, but we'd have to defer to that bureau.
Representative May.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Earlier, I was reminded of a SNL skit I saw a few years back where there was an executive playing an executive in a cigarette company, and they asked him, well, do cigarettes cause cancer? And he goes, your risk of cancer from cigarettes is no different than an x-ray, over and over and over again. The point of that was that we've heard, now I'm up to 3 different measurements of radiation exposure, none of which, even me as an engineer, the only one I can vaguely even recognize as REMS. I kind of got a pretty good picture of what that is, but now we've heard picocuries, and then I don't recall the one. So how would the general public be able to assess their exposure? Let's say this site that we're talking about has, an average visit exposes you to 2 picocuries or whatever. Makes absolutely no sense to folks. So isn't there a better way to describe the potential, well, not just the potential effects, but the exposure on some of these kind of things? I mean, I'm very familiar with Weldon Springs, heard about it my entire life. I wouldn't go out there to sniff daisies or stand on the top of the hill or anything, much less send my grandkids out there. So is there something that we do at the health department that puts kind of in layman's terms, perhaps, what our exposure is? As you pointed out, we get bombarded with radiation every day. We take it for granted, but we also make recommendations as a health department about wearing sunblock and limiting your exposure to in the peak hours of the day and those kind of things. Do we do that? Do we not do that? Is that something planned or what?
Yeah, we were talking about radiation and different metrics. It can get very complicated. Picocuries is a measure of disintegrations over a period of time. It's a really good measurement for how much radiation's in the environment. But like you said, that doesn't tell you very much about what it does to our body. So if you want to look at the biological impact of our body, because each isotope, each emission has a different level of activity and the amount of harm that it can do or impact it can do to your body, that's talked about in REMS or megarems or millirems. And converting that is it's not as easy as converting. It just varies because each one has a different activity, so each one is a different number that you multiply by. I'm sorry, what was the rest of the question?
So do we proactively make recommendations? For instance, we are aware of some of these sites, and now there is public access to at least one of them. And I'm certain that we are still doing, and we heard earlier today that there is ongoing legacy monitoring of the site. And do we have the health department? Have we taken that data that has already been collected and made health recommendations to be posted or notified in some way, folks notifying them of potential exposure on this site? This is a unique site. We're not talking about walking down the street in Crocker, Missouri. We're talking about a site that we know has specific issues with it related to a nuclear waste. And I don't know that there is or there isn't, but one would assume that we're probably seeing an exposure level out there higher than background, would be my guess. I don't know that that's a fact, but did we, as the health department, this is not accusatory or anything, it's just, do we think about those kind of things whenever, for instance, they wanted to open this site back up to public use? Did the health department get the opportunity to weigh in on that and make suggestions related to that, right? But people's exposure. So that was kind of where I was going with that. I'm sorry I didn't explain it very well.
No, yes, we have had an opportunity to review data. Many of the sites we've issued health consultations, health assessments, looking at the different types of exposures in an area. Kim mentioned the ATSGR's Coldwater Creek health assessment earlier. We do something very similar to that within the state in partnership with ATSGR. So we look to see if there would be any potential human health risk with being at those sites.
So on that same topic, we were talking about private wells earlier on, and I'm only tangentially aware about the health department's involvement in the private well category. But are you familiar enough with that program to answer a quick question on this? So, is there an ongoing active program, or is there a recommendation that goes out to people that live in rural areas, specifically is where we usually see these private wells, that there is testing available, and is there testing available, and is it through the health department?
So the question earlier was, are private wells regulated? And they're not. It's up to the individual property owner to have their house or their well tested. My bureau, the Bureau of Environmental Epidemiology, does provide some testing for residents. It's in the forms of metal testing. We don't have the ability to do radiological testing at this time, but it is something we can help someone through that has questions and potentially offer them some testing for those metals and E. coli bacteria. We tested around Weldon Springs area 150 wells over 20 or so years, looking for.
These were voluntarily provided. You folks requested that test, or you went in and suggested to them that they might want to get it tested?
Through that testing, we were receiving funding through DNR, through the feds, to actually go out and go door to door, especially in that local area. Some of the further ones out were more of a voluntary. People were interested, so we went out there and tested. That ended in 2013.
And do you remember what you discovered from that?
We found seven or eight of the wells that were above MCL's maximum contaminant levels, which are the regulations set for public drinking water standards.
Radiological MCLs.
Correct.
Okay. On the other issue, and the point that was made earlier, and I should have considered that, about how difficult that is. I mean, it never works like the movie, right? And, you know, so I can imagine how, you know, all of this data comes into your office, and then you try to put it in some kind of format where it's usable, and then analyze it in some form or fashion to be able to give you a direction of study. And so I can imagine that process is fairly complicated. You probably got a couple of folks that probably do that every day. So recognizing these trends might not be that easy. But is there something that you guys have said, you know, if we only had this widget, right? If we just had that one thing, then we could do this. Is that something that's common conversation? And if so, what is it? And is it something that we can think about providing to help this process out?
Mapping applications have advanced leaps and bounds over the last couple decades. So we continue to move forward. We continue to have experts that are learning more and more every day and how to use those. I would add those 8 locations. In addition to these sites, we also have naturally occurring radiation in the area because of the way the geology is working and some pinch points. So currently and historically, we've said that those locations, those wells, were associated most likely with those naturally occurring instead of site, because we're not seeing a delineated plume of waste leaving the site as discussed earlier. We talked to those individuals that had those elevated wells. We talked to them about filtration, what filtration's put on there. Often the recommendation was just a water softener, and then went back and continued to monitor those over the years to make sure that those got below MCLs and stayed low.
I just want to point out, when you found 7 to 8 wells that were over MCL for radiological material, that means that you found 7 to 8 homes that were not within the Superfund site where potentially those materials could have moved to their wells. And the one thing, because I've talked to the federal agencies, I would get thrown in my face when everybody was safe back in the day, was to remind me that uranium is occurring naturally. But I do want to point out that the uranium that was brought out to Weldon Spring was recycled uranium, which has transuranics. It was also the original material that would have been in that area was brought in from the Belgian Congo, which is the most radioactive in the world. And then that site worked to make it more radiological. So I would caution you guys to just dismiss any uranium above MCL as being a naturally occurring MCL in Weldon. To the point that would, if I was that neighbor, that would just send shivers down my spine to tell them that, well, it's just naturally occurring in Weldon. That's fine if it's Somewheresville, Missouri. That's not acceptable if you live anywhere within a stone throw of Weldon where they had stack emissions without any protection. So please don't ever dismiss uranium found in that area.
Understood. And really quick to answer your question, Representative, data. We are only ever as good as the data that we bring in.
Yep.
And that is an issue that I see not just in this area, but across the department.
And I have witnessed the Department of Energy, they've told me that. They've also told me last summer, you know, young person, wasn't fully informed, but they actually told me and Will Scharf that the pile out there behind Weldon that took $1 billion to clean up, that we will forever monitor, that it was a pile of scrap metal and Vaseline. So I do understand very much that the Department of Energy provides bad data.
So, Madam Chair, to redirect on that one, at least I hope in this particular case with those 7 wells or whatever it was, that we eliminated the isotopes that we knew existed on the site, because if my understanding of nuclear technology is that we process to get to U-235 through a fairly complicated centrifuge process, and if that isotope was showing up, well, then it can only be in one place. I'm going to assume that we at least made that analysis in that particular case to make sure that we weren't talking about background, not, or naturally occurring, not something that came off of that site. Is that your assessment of what that study did?
Correct. Yeah, what we weren't finding was not uranium, it was radium.
So radon gas, and
Radium,
which
which would break down to radon eventually.
yeah, so that, but which is what a lot of homes, but we shouldn't say a lot of homes, few homes experience, right?
1 in 3 in Missouri. We offer free radon testing through the Department of Health and encourage anyone to go out and get one of our detectors. 1 in 3 homes have levels above 4 pq per liter, which is EPA's recommendation to take action on.
But my point is that we do, I hope, take that extra step to make sure in this particular case, this area, that we are actually not just assuming that we have a naturally occurring source. We exclude those other possibilities through that process, right? And so in that study, was that something that we did, or was that stuff that we collected the sample and sent it to the federal government for them to do the analysis?
Department of Health collected that sample and Department of Health analyzed that for a sample to come lab.
Okay, is that a report that you guys generated on that?
We did a report and then we pulled the data again here recently and reopened that and reviewed that and recently reissued that. So yes, it's available online.
So is there any plans to do any further testing in that collection of wells again?
Not at this moment, no.
Okay.
We would look to the responsible party to do that.
Okay,
Thank
I'd
you.
like,
Thank you.
as a follow-up, to get those studies. I also had the EPA tell me last summer, after we looked at the Department of Labor's list that's ever growing from that site because of UICPA, they discovered 500 more chemicals that weren't there at the time of characterization. And I'd like to make sure that we actually tested for that particular isotope of uranium. I'd like to see that, because I just am a little wary that we tested it, because I know the 2002 to 2013, not our state, but our Department of Energy had some miscommunications, let's just call it that. And I would really like to revisit those wells in the work study or work session, but I would like to see all of those reports, and I'll share those well reports, what you tested for and what you found, with the rest of the members on the committee.
And Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, but the well testing entity's funding lapsed, right? That was, their funding was expired. Okay, yeah, just to,
The federal funding lapsed on that.
it ended, yeah, so.
Okay. I thank you guys so much for being here. I wanted to have citizens come up too. I hope everyone that's here realizes that the testimony, at least in my opinion, has been extremely valuable. And I hope you feel that it was worth your time to be here. We are gonna, as a follow-up, ask the other committee members if we think we should have a follow-up committee. At this point, I don't know, but I think we should have that conversation, and I'll get back to the community on what that response is. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And that concludes the hearing.
Excuse me. What? I was in line to speak and testify today.